Imagine you're one of the last people alive after everything you knew has collapsed. The cities are gone. The knowledge your grandparents took for granted has vanished. The sky itself doesn't look the way it used to. What do? You write it down. You try to warn whoever comes after you because you know, somehow, that this isn't the first time it's happened. And you have a horrible feeling it won't be the last. That's the unsettling idea sitting at the heart of a text called the Kolbrin Bible. And whether or not you've heard of it before tonight, I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to be thinking about it long after you close your eyes. The Kolbrin isn't like the religious texts most of us grew up with. It's older in some claims, stranger in almost all of them, and wrapped in so much controversy that even talking about it honestly requires a lot of careful footnotes. Some call it an ancient survival manual disguised as scripture. Others call it a clever hoax, stitched together far more recently than its supporters admit. What almost everyone agrees on is this. The Kolbrin is obsessed with catastrophe. Fire from the sky, oceans rising, darkness that swallows the sun for days. And after all of that, survivors picking through the ashes, trying to rebuild a world they barely remember. Tonight, we're going deep into that story. Not to tell you the Kolbrin is secretly true, and not to dismiss it either, because both of those approaches miss what's actually interesting here. We're going to look at what the text actually says, where it likely came from, what scholars and skeptics argue about its origins, and what, if anything, we can responsibly take from its warnings. Because buried underneath the controversy is a question that's genuinely worth asking. Does this ancient patchwork of memory describe a single doomsday event? Or is it hinting at something far more unsettling? A pattern, a cycle, collapse after collapse, civilization after civilization, each one convinced it was the last, each one wrong. If that idea doesn't send a small chill down your spine, just wait. We're only getting started before we go further. I want to know where in the world you're listening from right now. Seriously, drop a comment and tell me your city and what time it is where you are. I love seeing these come in. Last time I asked, I had someone listening in Lisbon at midnight, someone else in Manila during their morning coffee, and someone falling asleep in Toronto at 2 a.m. It's strange and kind of beautiful, all of us scattered across different time zones, tuning into the same mystery at completely different moments of our day. So go ahead, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I really do read these, and if you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to stories like this one, or you just want an easy way to keep these going in the background while you drive, cook, or wind down at night, the best way to support what we do here is by following the show on Spotify. It's genuinely the easiest way to keep up with new episodes, and if you enjoy what you hear, leaving a 5-star review helps more than you'd think. It tells Spotify to put this in front of more curious minds just like you. The link is right there in the description, so if you've got 30 seconds, that small click means a lot. Alright, back to the mystery, because to understand why the Kolbrin's warning feels so unsettling, we first have to understand what this strange document actually claims to be, where it supposedly came from, and why, for decades, historians have been arguing about whether it deserves to be taken seriously at all. So what exactly is the Kolbrin Bible? Let's start with the basics, because even that turns out to be more complicated than you'd expect. The Kolbrin, in its most common modern form, is a collection of documents first published in the 1990s, though its supporters insist the material inside is far, far older than that publication date suggests. Some claim roots stretching back thousands of years to ancient Egypt on one side and pre-Christian Celtic Britain on the other. That's not a small claim. That's two entirely different ancient cultures, separated by thousands of miles, and depending on which timeline you believe, possibly thousands of years, somehow ending up bound together in a single book. And that's really the first thing you need to understand about the Kolbrin. It's not one document. It's a patchwork, a compilation. Think of it less like a single ancient scroll discovered in a sealed tomb, and more like an anthology stitched together from multiple sources, multiple voices, multiple traditions, all filed under one title. The collection is typically divided into two broad sections. The first is often called the Egyptian books. These sections claim to preserve teachings, cosmological ideas, and historical accounts supposedly passed down from ancient Egyptian scribes, possibly connected to the era of Akhenaten, the pharaoh famous for his radical religious reforms. The Egyptian books deal with creation, with the nature of the soul, with kings and dynasties, and, most importantly for our purposes tonight, with catastrophe. Global catastrophe, the kind that ends civilizations. The second broad section is usually called the Celtic books. And here's where things get even stranger, because the tone shifts completely. Instead of Egyptian cosmology and pharaonic history, you get something that reads more like British folk tradition, oral memory, and moral instruction, supposedly preserved by Celtic communities in the centuries before Christianity swept across the Isles. Different voice, different culture, different concerns, but strangely thematically, still circling back to the same core obsessions: disaster, judgment, survival, the fragility of civilization. Now here's a question you're probably already asking. Why call it a Bible at all? And I want to address this directly because the name creates expectations that the text itself doesn't really satisfy. When most people hear the word Bible, they think of the Christian Bible specifically, the Old and New Testaments, a text with a known transmission history, thousands of manuscript copies, and centuries of textual scholarship mapping out exactly how it evolved. The Kolbrin isn't that. It's not a sequel to the Christian Bible, it's not a rival scripture claiming the same God, and it's not part of the same textual tradition at all. The word Bible here is being used in its older, more general sense, simply meaning book, or more specifically, a book of significant foundational writings. Some researchers argue the title was chosen deliberately to evoke authority and ancient weight, borrowing the gravitas of a familiar word without actually claiming direct continuity with Judeo-Christian scripture. Whether that was an honest choice or a marketing one is something we'll get into later. But for now, just file this away. The name Bible is doing a lot of work here, and maybe more work than the text itself can support. So if it's not connected to the Christian Bible, what's it actually about? What are the ideas that show up again and again across these very different sections? 4 themes dominate: judgment, disaster, morality, and survival. Judgment because the Kolbrin frequently frames catastrophe not as random chaos, but as consequence. Civilizations fall because they went wrong somehow. They grew arrogant, corrupt, disconnected from whatever moral or spiritual foundation had once sustained them. Disaster because the text returns obsessively to descriptions of global-scale calamity. Fire falling from the sky, darkness that blots out the sun for days at a time, floods that submerge familiar coastlines, earthquakes that swallow cities whole. Morality, because embedded in all of this destruction are instructions, guidance on how to live, how to treat others, how to maintain some kind of ethical order even when the physical world is falling apart around you. And survival, because ultimately that's the through line connecting every section, Egyptian or Celtic. Someone lived through the catastrophe. Someone wrote it down. Someone wanted the next generation to understand what happened, and maybe, just maybe, to avoid making the same mistakes. It's a compelling collection of ideas. It's also, frankly, a collection of claims that demand serious scrutiny before we go any further. Because unusual claims about ancient, multicultural, multi-millennia old texts require exactly the kind of careful, skeptical, source-critical approach that separates genuine historical inquiry from wishful thinking. Where did this material actually come from? Who compiled it? And when? What evidence exists beyond the text's own claims about itself? Those are the questions we need to answer next, because the story of how the Kolbrin came into modern hands is, if anything, stranger than the catastrophes it describes. And this is where the ground starts to move beneath the entire story. Because the Kolbrin does have an origin story, more than one, depending on who is telling it. It has ancient scribes, hidden manuscripts, Celtic keepers, monasteries, fires, secret preservation, generations of people protecting dangerous knowledge from a world that was not ready to hear it. It has all the ingredients of the perfect lost text narrative. And to be clear, that narrative is fascinating. According to versions repeated by supporters, some of the material began in ancient Egypt, written or preserved by scribes who witnessed the collapse of an old order. These writings were supposedly carried out of Egypt, passed through unknown hands, and eventually preserved in Britain. Other parts are said to have been maintained by Celtic communities, perhaps by religious groups sometimes identified with the Culdees, an early Christian monastic movement associated with Ireland and Scotland. Then comes the most dramatic part of the story, a catastrophic fire. In 1184, Glastonbury Abbey in England really did burn. That much is historical fact. It was a major medieval monastery, enormously important in English religious life, and the fire was devastating. In the Kolbrin transmission story, however, this event becomes something more. The claim is that ancient writings held at or connected to Glastonbury were rescued from the flames, hidden away, copied, and protected by small communities who understood their value. Think about how powerful that story is. A book about civilizations destroyed by fire and flood is itself supposedly saved from fire. A warning from the past survives because someone, at the last possible moment, carries it out of a burning building. It feels almost too perfect, like the manuscript is acting out its own message. Knowledge is fragile. Civilization is fragile. Save what you can before the roof comes down. But history does not work on what feels perfect. It works on evidence. And when historians talk about the provenance of a manuscript, that is what they mean. Provenance is the documented history of an object. Where was it found? Who owned it? When was it copied? What material was it written on? Can we examine the ink, the paper, the handwriting, the binding? Is there a catalogue entry from a monastery library? A letter mentioning it? A contemporary translation? A record of a sale? A donation? A confiscation? Anything that places the text in a specific place at a specific time? For a genuinely ancient manuscript, these questions are not boring technical details. They are everything. Imagine someone hands you a map and says it was drawn by a Roman general 2,000 years ago. The map might look old, the handwriting might look mysterious. The story attached to it might be incredible, but before you rewrite Roman history, you would want to know where it came from. Was it excavated from a documented archaeological site? Has the parchment been tested? Does the language match the period? Does the ink contain materials available at the time? Has anyone trained in Roman manuscripts examined it? Without those answers, you do not have a Roman map. You have an object with a Roman story attached to it. The same problem applies here, only on a much larger scale. The Kolbrin, as it exists today, is known primarily through modern editions. Supporters may describe it as a translation, compilation, or preservation of much older material. But the original ancient Egyptian manuscripts are not available for broad scholarly inspection. There is no universally accepted catalogue of surviving source documents that specialists can compare line by line with the modern text. There is no established chain of custody running from an Egyptian scribe through the ancient world, through medieval monasteries, and into a modern publication. That gap matters, because a gap in provenance is not just one missing chapter in the story. It changes the status of every claim that comes after it. If we cannot establish when a passage was written, we cannot confidently say what historical event it describes. If we cannot establish which language it was originally written in, we cannot confidently assess whether a translation is accurate. If we cannot identify an ancient source manuscript, we cannot determine whether unusual phrases preserve ancient memory, medieval imagination, or modern invention. And this is where people often get confused. The absence of proof is not proof that something is false. A manuscript can be real and still have a complicated history. Ancient texts are lost all the time. Documents are copied, altered, translated, summarized, and sometimes preserved in later forms after their originals disappear. Historians know this. Much of what we know about the ancient world comes through incomplete chains of transmission. But incomplete is not the same thing as undocumented. A text may have a broken chain, yet still leave clues. References in other works, old quotations, physical fragments, known scribal traditions, language that fits its alleged period. A manuscript family, with multiple copies branching backward toward an earlier source. This is how scholars reconstruct a text's past, not through blind trust, through comparison, through testing, through thousands of small pieces of evidence that slowly build a larger picture. With the Kolbrin, there is no broad scholarly consensus that the collection has been authenticated as an ancient Egyptian and Celtic source. That doesn't mean every line must be dismissed as worthless. It does mean the collection cannot simply be treated as a verified message from pharaonic Egypt or pre-Christian Britain. That distinction may sound cautious. It is cautious. It has to be, because extraordinary antiquity is not a mood. It is a historical claim, and historical claims have to survive contact with the methods designed to test them. Consider the scale of what is being proposed. A set of Egyptian writings, possibly thousands of years old, somehow survives beyond the known manuscript traditions of Egypt. It is transferred perhaps across cultures and continents. It is preserved in Britain. It survives medieval upheaval, religious change, monastic destruction, war, reform, and fire. Then it emerges in modern form, with warnings that seem uncannily relevant to people living in an age of nuclear weapons, climate anxiety, mass extinction, and social collapse. Could an ancient text have a strange survival history? Of course, history is full of strange survivals. But the more remarkable the story, the more important the documentation becomes. There is another problem too. The Kolbrin is not presented as one simple artifact. It is a collection with different alleged origins. Egyptian books, Celtic books, different settings, different voices, different historical worlds. That makes provenance even more important, not less. If one section came from ancient Egypt and another from medieval Britain, each section should leave different kinds of traces, different language patterns, different historical references, different manuscript traditions, different evidence of transmission. Instead, what readers encounter is largely a modern compiled text accompanied by a powerful story about what it may once have been. And stories of lost manuscripts are dangerous things. Not because they are always false, but because they can become immune to evidence. If no original can be found, the story says it was hidden. If no archive records it, the story says the records were destroyed. If the language seems modern, the story says it was heavily translated. Every missing piece becomes proof of secrecy rather than a reason for caution. That is how an intriguing possibility can quietly turn into assumed fact. So we need to hold two ideas in our minds at the same time. First, the Kolbrins' claimed transmission history is compelling. It speaks to a real human fear that knowledge can vanish in a single generation, that libraries burn, that conquerors erase records, that the survivors of catastrophe may carry the past only in fragments. Second, compelling is not the same as demonstrated. We can read the Kolbrin as literature. We can examine its themes. We can ask why its disaster imagery resonates so strongly now. We can compare its stories to older myths, historical catastrophes, and modern fears. But we cannot honestly begin by assuming that it is a securely authenticated ancient record. And that uncertainty follows us into every room this book opens. When it speaks of ancient kings, are we hearing preserved history or later invention? When it describes a world-ending celestial destroyer, are we hearing eyewitness memory, mythic symbolism, or a modern retelling shaped by older traditions? When it appears to predict collapse, is it prophecy from the distant past, or is it a text whose uncertain origin allows modern readers to place their own fears inside it? Those questions do not make the mystery less interesting. They make it more interesting, because before we can ask whether the Kolbrin predicted the fall of civilization, we have to ask something even more basic. Whose voice is speaking to us from these pages? The first voice we encounter is the voice that sounds Egyptian, or at least Egyptian in atmosphere. It speaks of creation and chaos, of rulers and priestly authority, of the first ordering of the world. It speaks as though human life exists beneath a vast cosmic structure, where the movements of heaven, the conduct of kings, the fate of nations, and the moral condition of ordinary people are all connected. This is the Egyptian portion of the Kolbrin. In modern editions, it is usually presented as a group of books concerned with origins, sacred history, royal power, laws, disasters, and the repeated failure of human beings to live within the order they were given. And right away we need to keep our footing. An Egyptian setting is not proof of Egyptian authorship. A text can use ancient names, royal language, creation imagery, and temple-like themes without being a surviving document from pharaonic Egypt. Writers have been imagining Egypt for thousands of years. Greeks did it, Romans did it, medieval writers did it, modern writers do it constantly. Egypt carries enormous symbolic weight. It is old, it is secretive, it is associated with tombs, lost knowledge, divine kings, monuments that outlast empires. So, when the Kolbrin sounds Egyptian, that tells us something important about the kind of world it wants to create. It does not by itself settle where or when the words were written, but within that world, a very clear pattern begins to emerge. First, there is order, then people forget the order. Then the world answers. Think about the role ancient Egypt plays in the human imagination. This was a civilization built around cycles. The Nile rose and fell. Crops appeared and disappeared. The sun died each evening in the west, and returned each morning in the east. Kings were not merely politicians, in Egyptian religious thought at least as we understand it from known ancient sources. The ruler had a sacred duty. He was supposed to preserve Mat, a difficult word usually translated as truth, balance, justice, right order. Mat meant the world functioning as it should, the river flooding in its season, the gods receiving their rights, families honouring obligations, courts judging fairly, the strong not devouring the weak, the king holding back chaos. The Kolbrin's Egyptian books move through a similar moral landscape. They are interested in the condition of society long before they are interested in its destruction. They ask what happens when power becomes corrupt, what happens when leaders fail, what happens when people become violent, arrogant, greedy, dishonest, or spiritually blind, and then they take that question one step further. What if moral disorder does not stay inside human beings? What if it spreads outward? What if a corrupt society creates a corrupt world? This is one of the oldest and most powerful ideas in religious literature. The universe is not indifferent. Human conduct matters on a cosmic scale. When a people violate the laws of justice, heaven itself may become hostile. The sky darkens, the earth shakes, fire falls, waters rise. The structures people thought were permanent turn out to be temporary after all. That is the engine driving much of the Kolbrin's catastrophe material. The disasters are never just disasters. They are judgments. Not necessarily in the simple sense that every victim is guilty and every survivor is innocent. The text is usually more interested in collective failure than individual accounting. A whole civilization can lose its way. Its rulers can become cruel. Its religious authorities can become hollow. Its people can become obsessed with comfort, status, pleasure, wealth, and power. And by the time the catastrophe arrives, the collapse has already begun inside them. The fire, flood, darkness, or celestial terror is not the beginning of the fall. It is the revelation of a fall that was already underway. That is a very different way of looking at catastrophe. Modern people often separate natural disaster from moral failure. An earthquake is geology, a flood is weather. A disease outbreak is biology. A comet is astronomy. These things may be terrible, but they are not usually understood as verdicts on the ethical condition of the people living beneath them. The Kolbrin does not think that way. Its world is morally charged. Nature is not just background scenery. Heaven is not just empty space above the clouds. The earth is not merely a platform on which humans build cities and fight wars. Everything is connected. When rulers become unjust, when societies become disordered, when people abandon wisdom, the whole structure becomes unstable. And this is why the text keeps returning to kings. Kings are not simply characters, they are pressure points. A ruler represents the state of the nation. If he is wise, disciplined, and just, he helps preserve order. If he is vain, cruel, weak, or corrupt, the disorder spreads downward. Officials imitate him, courts become compromised. The poor suffer. Priests flatter power, truth becomes dangerous. The country may still look impressive from the outside. It may still have palaces, armies, ceremonies, wealth, and laws written on stone. But internally, something has gone wrong. This is the pattern the Kolbrin seems most determined to preserve. Civilizations do not always fall at the moment of impact. Sometimes they fall years earlier, when nobody can tell the truth anymore. Sometimes they fall when leaders begin treating responsibility as entitlement. When institutions exist to protect themselves rather than the people. When social trust disappears. When greed is admired as strength. When warnings are ignored because acknowledging danger would threaten the people benefiting from the existing order. Then comes the disruption, and it is overwhelming. The Egyptian books describe creation as an emergence from disorder, a bringing of form out of chaos. This matters because catastrophe becomes the reversal of creation. The boundaries that made life possible begin to fail. Light gives way to darkness. Stable ground becomes unstable. Water becomes destructive rather than life-giving. The sky, which should follow its eternal path, appears to become strange, terrifying, and unpredictable. It is as if the world is going backward, back toward the first chaos. That is why the destruction imagery feels so intense. It is not merely describing people dying in a disaster. It is describing reality itself losing its familiar shape. The dependable order of seasons, stars, rivers, rulers, and social obligations is suddenly gone. People who believed they lived in a permanent civilization discover that permanence was an illusion. And the text's question is brutal. What remains when the order you trusted disappears? Not just your house, not just your city, not just your government. What remains of you? Can people who have forgotten restraint suddenly become disciplined? Can a society built on selfishness suddenly cooperate? Can leaders who ignored every warning become wise when the sky turns red and the ground begins to break beneath them? The Kolbrin is skeptical. Again and again its underlying message is that catastrophe exposes character. It does not create it from nothing. Fear strips away appearances. It reveals who can act with courage, who can preserve knowledge, who can protect others, and who will exploit the panic. This is where the Egyptian books become more than a collection of ancient-sounding stories about kings and gods. They become a theory of collapse. First comes arrogance, then injustice, then denial, then the signs that something is wrong, then the moment when the old world cannot hold, whether that pattern preserves ancient memory, borrows from older religious traditions, or reflects a much later moral imagination, remains disputed. But the pattern itself is unmistakable. The Kolbrin does not present civilization as something guaranteed by technology, wealth, armies, or monuments. It presents civilization as a fragile agreement with order. Break that agreement long enough, and eventually, the text warns, chaos comes to collect. But then the collection changes its accent. The sky is still dangerous. The moral stakes are still enormous. Human beings are still capable of destroying the order that keeps them alive. But the voice becomes different. The later Celtic-themed books of the Kolbrin move away from the world of Egyptian kings, temple atmosphere, primordial creation, and cosmic judgment. Their world is Britain, tribal territories, clans and household loyalties, chiefs, judges, warriors, teachers and communities trying to hold themselves together in a harsh and uncertain land. This is no longer mainly a story about the universe falling back into chaos. It is a story about people living after chaos has become part of their memory. And that change matters. The Egyptian material looks upward. It asks what happens when heaven turns against an unjust world. It imagines catastrophe on a scale so large that the sun, waters, earth and stars seem caught up in the crisis. The Celtic material looks sideways. It looks at neighbours, at families, at tribal obligations, at disputes over land, inheritance, honour and leadership. It is concerned with the smaller machinery of survival. Who has authority? What makes a judgment fair? What happens when a chief becomes selfish? What does a community owe its weakest members? How do people preserve a law when power is held by those who benefit from breaking it? These may sound like smaller questions than the terror of the heavens. They are not, because once the flood has passed, once the fires are out, once the terrified survivors have stopped waiting for the sky to fall, these are the questions that decide whether anyone can build a life again. A disaster can destroy a city in a day, but rebuilding trust can take generations. That is one of the deepest shifts in the Celtic books. They are less interested in the moment the world ends than in the long, exhausting work of preventing the next ending. They speak from a landscape where memory itself has become a survival tool. The past is not safely buried, it remains active. Old failures are remembered because forgetting them would be dangerous. Picture a small community after a period of violence or famine. Fields have been neglected. Families have lost members. Food stores are low, every stranger may be a trader, a refugee, a thief or an enemy scout. A weak leader can turn suspicion into bloodshed. A corrupt judge can break the bond between families. A powerful warrior can seize more than his share and call it strength. Under those conditions, law is not some abstract document sitting in a building. Law is food security. Law is whether revenge becomes endless. Law is whether a widow keeps her home. Law is whether a hungry family is protected or abandoned. Law is whether the strong are allowed to consume everyone else until the tribe is too divided to survive the next hard winter. The Celtic portion of the Kolbrin repeatedly returns to this kind of pressure, not always in the language of modern politics, obviously. Its moral world is older, more tribal, more concerned with rank, kinship, sacred duty, and personal honour. But the central fear is recognisable. A people can be defeated before an enemy arrives. They can be defeated by greed among their own leaders, by false judgments, by feuds that become more important than the common good, by men who speak constantly of honour while acting without mercy, by spiritual teachers who preserve ceremonies but lose wisdom, by communities that remember old grievances more clearly than they remember their shared dependence on one another. This is the social version of the Egyptian warning. In the Egyptian books, disorder spreads outward. A corrupt people lose harmony with the structure of the cosmos. In the Celtic books, disorder spreads through the human network. It moves through households, alliances, courts, tribes, and generations. It turns neighbours into rivals. It makes every disagreement a test of strength. It replaces duty with appetite. And once that happens, even a society untouched by fire from heaven may already be in danger. Because civilizations do not survive on buildings alone. They survive on cooperation. They survive because people believe promises will be kept. Because children can learn from elders. Because rules apply to the powerful as well as the weak. Because knowledge is passed on instead of hoarded. Because when scarcity comes, people can still see one another as members of the same human community. The Celtic books are intensely concerned with this question of endurance. Not the endurance of stone monuments or royal dynasties, but the endurance of a people. How does a community carry its identity through defeat, migration, conquest, famine, or political collapse? What must be protected when everything else is lost? The answer is not simply weapons. It is memory, memory of laws, memory of obligations, memory of those who acted wisely in earlier crises, memory of the consequences when leaders failed, memory of the old moral boundaries that kept a frightened population from becoming a pack of enemies. This is why the blend of Egyptian and Celtic traditions is one of the most debated features of the entire Kolbrin collection. On the surface, it is an extraordinary combination. Ancient Egypt and Celtic Britain are separated by geography, language, religion, and immense stretches of time. One evokes temples, pharaohs, desert, and the Nile. The other evokes tribal lore, northern landscapes, heroic struggle, and the later cultural world of Britain. How did these voices end up in the same book? Supporters of the Kolbrin have sometimes offered elaborate explanations. They suggest hidden lines of transmission, sacred records carried across centuries, fragments preserved by secretive religious communities, or memories passed from one civilization to another through migration, trade, and catastrophe. Critics see the mixture very differently. They argue that the collection's Egyptian and Celtic elements may point not to an ancient chain of preservation, but to much later composition. A writer or a group of writers could have drawn on several traditions at once. Egypt gave the work its cosmic antiquity, its aura of lost wisdom and ancient catastrophe. Celtic material gave it another kind of authority, the authority of ancestral Britain, tribal endurance, moral struggle, and a people surviving on the edge of history. And to be clear, the presence of two ancient-sounding traditions does not prove either explanation. It proves that the text is unusual. It proves that it wants to speak with more than one voice. One voice remembers the terror of a world shaken from above. The other remembers what people must do below. Maybe that is why the combination remains so compelling. The Egyptian material asks whether the universe can punish a civilization that has abandoned order. The Celtic material asks whether people can preserve order when the universe, history, or their own leaders have betrayed them. Together, they create a much larger story. Disaster is not just the impact. It is what comes before the impact, when people become careless and corrupt. It is what happens during the impact, when fear exposes character. And it is what comes after, when survivors must decide whether they will rebuild the same failures that destroyed them. That is the real function of memory in these books. Memory is not nostalgia. It is not a collection of pleasant stories about ancestors. It is a warning system. A people who remember only their glory may repeat their mistakes. A people who remember suffering, injustice, betrayal, courage, and endurance may have a chance to recognize danger before it becomes irreversible. And that brings us closer to the Kolbrin's most haunting image of all. Not merely a fallen kingdom, not merely a corrupt tribe, not merely the slow decay of law and leadership, but something approaching from the darkness beyond the ordinary world. Something the text calls the Destroyer. The name alone does most of the work. The Destroyer, not an invading army, not a rival king, not a drought, a plague, or a rebellion inside the walls. The Destroyer comes from above. In the Catastrophe passages associated with the Kolbrin's Egyptian material, the heavens stop being distant and orderly. The sky becomes a source of terror. A strange presence appears. It is described in language of flame, redness, smoke, darkness, trembling earth, boiling waters, fear spreading through populations that no longer understand what they are seeing. This is the image that made the Kolbrin famous among modern readers, because it feels less like an ordinary ancient myth, and more like a report from the edge of the unimaginable. The text does not present the Destroyer as a small sign in the sky, something people notice and then forget. It is overwhelming. It approaches, it burns, it darkens the world. It seems to throw the natural order into reverse. The normal boundaries between sky, earth, sea, and fire begin to break down, and that is exactly what catastrophe feels like to the people inside it. When a civilization is stable, nature seems divided into reliable categories. The sky stays above, the ground stays below. Water remains in rivers and seas. Day turns into night at a predictable time. Seasons return. The sun rises, the stars move as they always have. But during a true disaster, those assumptions collapse one by one. The river becomes an enemy. The earth moves, the daylight disappears. Fire comes from places where fire should not be, and people who believed their world was permanent discover that permanence was only a habit of thought. That is the emotional force behind the Destroyer. It is not merely a thing in the sky. It is the end of predictability itself. The descriptions are dramatic, sometimes almost hallucinatory. Readers encounter fire in the heavens, a blood-coloured or threatening sky, darkness and smoke, great upheavals of land and water, populations gripped by terror. The language moves at the scale of total devastation. It does not describe one damaged village or one defeated kingdom. It imagines a world in which everyone is forced to look upward and realize that human power means very little. A king cannot command the heavens, a temple cannot bargain with a falling fire. An army cannot fight the sky, and in the Kolbrin's moral universe that helplessness is important. The Destroyer arrives in a world already weakened by human failure. People have forgotten limits. Leaders have become corrupt. Order has been broken. The catastrophe is cosmic, but it is also ethical. Heaven does not simply become dangerous, it becomes a mirror, reflecting back the disorder below. Now, this is where modern readers begin asking the obvious question. What was the destroyer? Was it a comet, a meteor or asteroid? A close pass by an unknown planet? A giant volcanic event remembered as a flaming celestial terror? A series of disasters compressed into one terrifying story over generations of retelling? Or was it never meant to be identified with a physical object at all? Supporters of the Kolbrin have proposed nearly every possibility. Some connect the destroyer to a comet passing close to Earth, its tail visible in the sky while debris, atmospheric disturbances, or later disasters ravaged the world below. Others imagine a rogue planet or a massive celestial body moving through the inner solar system. Some link it to ancient flood traditions, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or even the memory of an impact event. These theories are understandable. The imagery practically invites them. A blazing object in the sky, darkness, fire, earthquakes, flooding, a world in panic. It sounds like the kind of language people might use if they witnessed a real natural catastrophe without possessing modern astronomy, geology, or atmospheric science. If the sun vanished behind dust, if fires spread across the horizon, if earthquakes broke open roads and walls, if storms or tidal waves followed, ancient survivors would not describe it in scientific terms. They would describe it as a destroyer. But that possibility is not the same thing as proof, and this distinction matters. The Kolbrin does not provide the kind of information scientists need to identify a specific object. There is no reliable date, no precise astronomical observation, no independently verified record tying its description to a known comet, impact, volcanic eruption, or planetary encounter. Its language is poetic, religious, and apocalyptic. It is built to convey terror and judgment, not to function like a modern field report. So when someone says the destroyer was definitely a comet, they are moving beyond what the text can establish. When someone says it was definitely a planet, or definitely an asteroid, or definitely evidence of a forgotten global civilization destroyed in a single event, they are doing the same thing. They may be offering an interpretation. They are not presenting a settled historical conclusion. In fact, the uncertainty around the Kolbrin's origins makes those claims even more difficult. If the collection's textual history cannot be securely traced into deep antiquity, then it cannot simply be treated as direct eyewitness testimony from ancient Egypt. The words may preserve older themes, they may echo traditional catastrophe imagery. They may be a later composition drawing on ancient religious and mythological language. We do not know with confidence, but here is the strange part. The uncertainty has not weakened the destroyer's power. It may have made it stronger, because a vague threat can enter any era. A named comet can be tracked. A dated eruption can be studied. An ancient empire can become archaeology. But the destroyer remains undefined enough to absorb every modern fear. In one generation, it becomes a comet. In another, an asteroid. For some, it is a wandering planet. For others, it is solar catastrophe, nuclear war, ecological collapse, or the return of a cycle that human beings were warned about and ignored. The destroyer becomes whatever seems capable of ending the world people know. That is why it sits at the centre of modern apocalyptic readings of the Kolbrin. Online discussions, prophecy communities, alternative history writers and catastrophe researchers often treat these passages as a warning about an approaching celestial event. They read ancient-sounding descriptions of fire and darkness as coded astronomy. They search for hidden calendars, orbital patterns, suppressed knowledge, and evidence that past civilizations were destroyed because they failed to prepare. Sometimes the Kolbrin is presented not as a difficult and disputed collection of texts, but as a survival manual from the last world-ending disaster. That is a much more exciting story. It is also a much more dangerous one if excitement replaces evidence. Because once the destroyer is treated as a literal forecast, every unusual event in the sky can become a sign. Every comet becomes suspicious. Every eclipse becomes ominous. Every earthquake, wildfire, flood, or political crisis becomes proof that the ancient warning is unfolding again. And fear has a way of making disconnected events feel like a pattern. Still, dismissing the destroyer as just mythology misses something too. Myths are not meaningless because they are not scientific measurements. Ancient people used cosmic language to talk about experiences that exceeded ordinary explanation. They knew that societies could fall. They knew that flood, famine, fire, war, and disease could erase generations of work. They knew that the natural world could become terrifying without asking anyone's permission. The destroyer gives that knowledge a face. It turns catastrophe into an approaching presence. Something visible. Something people can fear. Something they might have been warned about long before it arrived. And once that figure enters the story, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly happens when it comes? What does the world look like when fire, flood, darkness, and earthquake no longer belong to separate disasters, but arrive together as one great unmaking? What does the world look like when all the boundaries fail at once? According to the catastrophe language associated with the Kolbrin, it looks like a world that has forgotten its own rules. Fire does not stay in the hearth, water does not stay in the river, darkness does not wait for night, the ground does not remain solid beneath people's feet. The sky, the sea, the land, and the human world all become dangerous at the same time. And that combination is what makes these passages so disturbing. A flood by itself is terrible, but people know what a flood is. They run for higher ground. They protect what they can. They wait for the waters to recede. An earthquake is terrifying, but it ends. Buildings fall, roads split, people search through rubble, and eventually the shaking stops. A volcanic eruption can blacken the sky and bury entire settlements, but it has a source. A mountain, a vent, a horizon glowing red in the distance. But what happens when the flood comes with fire? When darkness comes in the middle of the day? When storms rage overhead while the earth convulses below? When people cannot tell whether the danger is coming from the heavens, the sea, or the ground beneath them? That is the world the Kolbrin's destruction imagery creates. Not one disaster. Total environmental chaos. The passages are not arranged like a modern emergency report. Nobody is taking measurements. Nobody is separating one event from another and writing down exact times, locations, wind speeds, seismic intensities, or the chemical composition of the smoke. The language is larger than that. It piles horror upon horror. Fire in the sky, redness, smoke, roaring waters, darkness, trembling land, storms, destruction falling upon cities and people who are already terrified. It is catastrophe described from inside the panic. And when people are inside a disaster, events do not arrive in neat categories. Imagine standing in an ancient city during a major eruption or earthquake. The ground begins to move, walls crack, storage jars shatter, animals panic, fires start from overturned lamps and broken cooking places. Dust rises so thickly that daylight fades. Then a storm arrives, or heavy rain turns ash and debris into deadly mud. A river overflows. The coastline shifts, people flee, but they do not know where safety is anymore. Later, survivors do not necessarily say, first there was seismic activity, then atmospheric fallout, followed by flooding. They say the heavens burned. They say the earth opened. They say day became night. They say the waters rose against them. They say the world was destroyed. That is the level of reality these images operate on. Fire is one of the strongest motifs. Fire appears above, below, and all around. It may be read as celestial flame, lightning, volcanic glow, burning cities, or the red haze of a dust-filled atmosphere at sunrise and sunset. Modern readers often focus on the image of fire in the heavens because it seems to point towards something coming from space. A comet, a meteor shower, an impact event, some enormous object visible in the sky. And yes, ancient observers witnessing an unfamiliar celestial event might describe it in fiery language. A bright comet can look like a burning sword, a torch, a dragon, a tail of flame. A meteor entering the atmosphere can appear like the sky itself has caught fire. But fire from heaven is also ancient religious language. It can mean divine anger, it can mean war, it can mean lightning, it can mean a terrifying red sky before a storm. It can mean almost anything that makes people look upward and feel that the normal world has ended. Then there is water. The Kolbrin's catastrophe imagery includes waters behaving as though they have broken free of their place. Seas become violent, floodwaters rise, great waves or overwhelming inundations are often imagined by readers. This is why the text gets connected to flood traditions from Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible, Greece, India, and cultures across the world. Because flood is the ancient disaster almost everyone remembers. Water is necessary for life. Rivers create farmland. Seasonal rains feed crops. Seas carry trade. But when water crosses its boundaries, it becomes a force no wall can fully resist. It enters houses, ruins granaries, contaminates wells, carries away bodies, and destroys the records, tools, and stored food that make settled life possible. A city can survive the loss of a building. It may not survive the loss of its harvest, its drinking water, its roads, and its population all at once. Darkness makes everything worse. In the Kolbrin's apocalyptic atmosphere, darkness is not peaceful nighttime. It is disorientation. It is the loss of the sun, the loss of direction, the loss of the basic rhythm that tells human beings when to work, sleep, travel, plant, gather and pray. Readers have connected this darkness to volcanic ash clouds, massive storms, wildfire smoke, dust thrown into the atmosphere by an impact, or even eclipses remembered and magnified through retelling. All of these are possibilities in the broadest sense. Each can make daylight vanish or turn the sun an unnatural colour. But the text itself does not let us choose confidently between them. Darkness is physical, but it is also symbolic. A darkened world is a world without guidance. The rulers cannot see what is coming. The priests cannot restore order. Families cannot find one another. The old confidence that tomorrow will resemble today disappears beneath a sky that no longer makes sense. And then the earth moves. Earthquake language is perhaps the most immediate of all. The ground is supposed to be the one thing people can trust. You can fear the storm, but at least you stand on solid land. You can watch the river rise, but at least the earth remains beneath your house. Until it does not, when the land trembles, civilization reveals how fragile it is. Temples built over generations crack in minutes. Palaces collapse. City walls become traps. Roads break. Wells fail. Fires begin. In a dense settlement, the danger multiplies because every structure depends on every other structure remaining stable. One violent earthquake can turn the achievements of centuries into rubble before anyone has time to understand what is happening. Now, put all of these images together. Fire, flood, darkness, earthquake. The result is not simply a list of natural disasters. It is a vision of total vulnerability. The ordinary world is being unmade from every direction. Above is hostile. Below is hostile. Water is hostile. Air is hostile. Even the daylight people depend on has become unreliable. That is why attempts to identify one single cause can miss the deeper point. Was the text remembering a volcanic eruption? Maybe. Was it remembering an earthquake and tsunami? Possibly. Was it preserving distorted memories of a comet, an impact, or a chain of regional disasters that later became one cosmic story? Some readers think so, but it may also be doing what catastrophe traditions have always done, taking every form of destruction people feared most and combining them into one overwhelming account of a civilization brought to its knees. Poetic catastrophe language is not useless because it is not technical, but it cannot be treated as technical evidence without caution. A line about the sea rising is not a tide gauge. A line about fire in the sky is not an astronomical chart. A line about the earth shaking is not a seismic record. These images may preserve fear. They may preserve cultural memory. They may echo real experiences of flood, storm, eruption, famine, or war. But they have passed through the language of religion, moral warning, storytelling, and apocalypse. They are designed to make a listener feel the collapse of order, not to give a future geologist a clean data set. And yet the picture they create is hauntingly realistic in one important way. Civilizations rarely fail through one clean, isolated blow. A flood becomes a food crisis. A fire becomes displacement. Darkness becomes crop failure. An earthquake becomes disease, homelessness, panic, and political collapse. One disaster weakens the systems needed to survive the next. Granaries are destroyed. Roads are blocked. Trade stops. Clean water disappears. Leaders lose control. Rumours spread faster than help. And suddenly a society that looked permanent a month ago is fighting just to keep people alive. That is the real terror behind the Kolbrin's vision. Not that a mysterious object appears in the sky, but that the world people built was never as secure as they believed. And once fire, flood, darkness, and earthquake have broken the old order, the next danger does not come from nature alone. It comes from human beings trying to survive what remains. And that raises the question people keep coming back to. What if there really was something behind it? What if the catastrophe language in the Kolbrin is not just invention, symbolism, or religious warning? What if, buried beneath the fire, the flood, the darkness, and the shaking earth, there is a memory of a real disaster so terrible that people kept telling the story for generations, then centuries, then perhaps thousands of years? It sounds impossible at first. How could any memory survive that long? But human beings have been doing exactly that for as long as human beings have had stories. Long before writing, people passed knowledge from one generation to the next through repetition. Stories told around fires, warnings attached to sacred places, songs about dangerous rivers, myths about mountains that once exploded, tales of a coast swallowed by the sea. These were not always just entertainment. Sometimes they were survival information in narrative form. Don't go there when the water rises. Do not build too close to the river. The mountain that looks asleep can wake up. The sea can come farther inland than anyone expects. The sky can darken, the crops can fail, and the old rules can disappear overnight. A story does not need to preserve exact dates to preserve a real fear. And ancient communities had plenty of real disasters to remember. Regional floods could destroy settlements and reshape entire landscapes. In river civilizations, flood was both the source of life and the ultimate threat. A normal seasonal flood brought fertile soil. An unusually powerful one could wipe out homes, grain stores, animals and people in a matter of hours. If a community lived beside a river generation after generation, it did not need a planet-wide flood to create a story about the waters swallowing the world. It only needed the world it knew to vanish beneath water. Volcanic eruptions could produce an equally apocalyptic memory. Imagine people watching a mountain explode. Ash begins falling like grey snow. Daylight fades, breathing becomes difficult, fields are buried. Water turns foul. Tremors continue for days or weeks. Then rain arrives and transforms loose ash into fast-moving mud flows that can tear through valleys and bury towns far from the eruption itself. To the people living through it, that is not a geological event. That is heaven and earth at war. The eruption of Thera in the Bronze Age Aegean is often brought up in discussions of ancient catastrophe memory. It was one of the largest eruptions of the ancient world, and it affected communities across the eastern Mediterranean. Others point to earthquakes and tsunamis which could destroy coastal settlements with almost no warning. A massive wave does not need to cover every continent to become, in local memory, a sea that rose against all humanity. Then there is drought. Drought is less dramatic than fire falling from the sky, but historically it has destroyed civilizations just as effectively. It comes slowly. First, the rains fail. Then crops weaken. Wells shrink. Herds die. Food prices rise. Families move. Cities become tense. Governments lose revenue. Armies go unpaid. Trade routes become dangerous. A society can remain standing for years while its foundations quietly disappear beneath it. And when drought is followed by famine, disease, migration, and war, survivors may remember the entire period as one great destruction. Not because every event happened on the same day, but because everything they trusted failed in the same lifetime. This is where cultural memory becomes complicated. A real event can survive in oral tradition, but it does not survive untouched. Every retelling selects details. Some details are forgotten. Others become larger. A flood becomes a flood sent as judgment. A volcanic cloud becomes darkness, covering the whole earth. A comet becomes a fiery serpent. An earthquake becomes the land opening its mouth. A city destroyed by war becomes a civilization punished for pride. The core experience may be real, but the language grows around it. Think of it like a stone dropped into a lake. The stone is the original event, a flood, an eruption, a famine, an invasion, a collapse. But the ripples are all the later generations trying to explain what happened. Priests give it moral meaning. Rulers use it as a warning. Families reshape it around local landmarks. Storytellers add images that listeners will remember. Eventually, the event is no longer a report. It becomes a myth. That does not make it worthless. It means we have to read it differently. A myth can tell us what a people feared. It can reveal what kinds of disasters had scarred their collective imagination. It can preserve fragments of landscape change, unusual weather, lost settlements, or social breakdown. But it cannot automatically be treated like a documentary record. This is especially important with a Kolbrin. Some modern readers want the text to be evidence for one precise global catastrophe. They search for a date, a comet, a rogue planet, a pole shift, a single ancient event that explains every image of destruction. Fire in the sky becomes proof of an impact. Flood becomes proof of a worldwide deluge. Darkness becomes proof of atmospheric collapse. Earthquakes become proof that the entire planet was breaking apart. But the evidence does not support that level of certainty. No single real-world event has been conclusively matched to the Kolbrin's narratives. There is no universally accepted archaeological site, eruption, flood layer, impact crater, or historical date that can be pointed to and said without doubt, this is what the text describes. There are possibilities. There are parallels. There are disasters in ancient history, dramatic enough to make the language feel familiar. But familiar is not the same as proven, and one more complication matters here. The Kolbrin is itself surrounded by questions of manuscript history, dating, transmission, and authenticity. That makes attempts to extract precise prehistoric or ancient scientific data from it even more uncertain. Before asking whether a passage remembers an event from thousands of years ago, we also have to ask when that passage took its present form, who preserved it, and how much it may have changed along the way. So maybe the better question is not which exact catastrophe was this. Maybe the better question is, why does this catastrophe language feel so believable? The answer may be that it is built from the disasters human societies have always known. Rivers rising beyond control, mountains throwing fire into the sky, years without rain, earthquakes destroying cities, wars and migrations following hunger, the collapse of order after the systems that feed, protect and connect, people suddenly fail. The Kolbrin may not preserve a precise global historical report, but it may preserve something almost as important, the ancient understanding that civilization is never only threatened by one spectacular moment. It is threatened by the chain reaction that follows, and that chain reaction begins long before the final collapse. It begins when a society starts mistaking temporary stability for permanent safety. That may be the deepest warning in the Kolbrin, not that destruction comes from nowhere. Not that a mysterious force appears in the sky one day and wipes out a perfect, innocent world. The pattern is darker than that. Before the fire, before the flood, before the earth shakes and the sky turns strange, society is already sick. The disaster does not create every problem. It exposes the problems that were there all along. Read the catastrophe passages as moral warning, and the same signs keep appearing. Pride, greed, corruption, injustice, violence, leaders who fail the people they are supposed to protect. People who have become comfortable enough to believe consequences belong to someone else. The language is ancient, sometimes dramatic, sometimes theological. But the underlying idea is surprisingly familiar. A civilization rarely collapses because of only one thing. A drought may begin the crisis. An earthquake may destroy a capital. A flood may erase farmland. An invasion may push across a weakened border. But whether that shock becomes a temporary disaster or a full civilizational breakdown depends on what existed before the shock arrived. Think of two houses in the path of the same storm. One has been maintained. The roof is secure. The foundation is sound. The people inside have food, tools, and a plan. It may be damaged badly, but it can survive. The other house looks impressive from the outside. But the beams are rotten. The roof leaks. The foundation has cracks running through it. Everyone inside has been arguing over who owns what, while nobody repairs the walls. When the storm comes, it does not have to be extraordinary. It only has to be strong enough. That is the pattern the Kolbrin seems to be reaching for. The external event is terrifying, but it lands on a society that has already made itself fragile. Arrogance is part of that fragility, not simple confidence. Not ambition. The text's warning, as many readers understand it, is about the kind of pride that makes people think they are beyond correction. The belief that wealth proves wisdom, that power proves virtue, that the old limits no longer apply because this time, somehow, the system is different. Every age has versions of that belief. The harvest will always come. Trade will always continue. The river will remain predictable. The granaries will stay full. The soldiers will remain loyal. The rulers will know what to do, and when a society begins believing its own stability is automatic, it stops preparing for instability. Then comes injustice. This is where the moral language can be read not only as religious judgment, but as a diagnosis of social weakness. A society with extreme inequality may still look powerful. Palaces rise, temples are funded, armies march, markets are busy. But if food shortages begin, if taxes increase, if refugees arrive, if trade breaks down, the people already living closest to the edge are hit first. And they do not have reserves. They do not have influence. They do not have protected storehouses or private guards. So desperation spreads upward through the social order. Farmers abandon fields, workers flee cities, local officials take what they can before someone else does. Theft rises. Violence rises. Trust disappears. The wealthy may try to seal themselves behind walls, but walls cannot make crops grow. They cannot force broken roads to carry food. They cannot command loyalty from people who have spent years being ignored. In that sense, injustice is not just a moral failure. It is a structural failure. It turns a difficult year into famine. It turns a political dispute into rebellion. It turns a damaged city into a city no one is willing to rebuild. Corruption works the same way. In a stable period, corruption can hide. A dishonest official skims grain from storage. A contractor uses poor materials on a bridge. A governor sends false reports to the capital. A military commander inflates troop numbers. A ruler surrounds himself with flatterers who say everything is under control. For a while, nothing happens. The bridge stays standing. The granaries appear full. The army still looks impressive during parades. The reports keep arriving, stamped and official, telling the people above that all is well. Then the flood comes, the bridge fails, the grain is missing. The soldiers are fewer than expected, and the leaders discover that they have spent years governing a picture of reality rather than reality itself. That is why failed leadership matters so much in collapse stories. When ordinary systems are working, poor leaders can sometimes survive by doing very little. But crisis is a test of coordination. Someone has to organize food. Someone has to distribute water. Someone has to keep roads open, settle disputes, prevent panic, and tell the truth about how bad things really are. If leadership is selfish, divided or blind, every emergency becomes worse. And violence is often what follows when trust finally breaks. The Kolbrin's world is not simply destroyed by nature. It is also destroyed by human beings turning against one another. Fear makes neighbours suspicious. Scarcity makes cooperation harder. Rumour becomes more powerful than law. Groups that once traded together begin competing for the same water, land and food. This is one of the most realistic parts of the warning. People do not need to become monsters for society to become violent. They only need to believe that the rules no longer protect them, that no help is coming, and that survival belongs to whoever takes first. History offers plenty of partial parallels. Ancient states have endured earthquakes, droughts, wars, and epidemics. Some recovered, others fragmented. The difference was rarely one single cause. Environmental stress interacted with debt, inequality, political conflict, failed harvests, weakened trade, population movement, and military pressure. Collapse was not a switch flipped in one night. It was a chain reaction. That does not mean the Kolbrin gives us a timetable. It does not tell us that a specific disaster must happen on a specific date. It does not provide reliable evidence for a coming comet, a final flood, or an unavoidable end to modern civilization. Those are interpretations modern readers often bring to the text, not conclusions the evidence can firmly support. But as a pattern of vulnerability, the warning has real force. A society becomes endangered when it cannot tell the truth about its own weaknesses, when leaders protect appearances instead of people, when wealth is concentrated while resilience is neglected, when institutions are hollowed out, when violence becomes normal, when everyone assumes the systems they depend on will function forever, even as the people responsible for maintaining those systems are pushed closer and closer to breaking point. Then an external shock arrives. Maybe it is natural. Maybe it is economic. Maybe it is political. Maybe it is all three at once. And suddenly the disaster is not just outside the walls. It is inside them. That is the pattern before the fall. Not prophecy in the narrow sense, not a proven map of the future. A warning that the greatest catastrophes often strike hardest where a civilization has already begun to collapse from within. And once that happens, the nature of the disaster changes. At first, the danger is physical. The river rises. The ground shakes. The harvest fails. Smoke covers the sky. A city loses its water supply. Roads become impassable. Storehouses burn. The immediate question is brutally simple. Where do you sleep tonight? What do you eat tomorrow? How do you keep your children alive until morning? But the Kolbrin's warning is not only interested in ruined buildings and darkened skies. It is interested in what happens to people when the ordinary world stops working. Because civilization is more than walls, roads, laws, and granaries. It is a web of expectations so familiar that most of us barely notice it. You expect food to arrive. You expect a stranger not to attack you in the street. You expect a promise to mean something. You expect someone to answer when you call for help. You expect that if you work, save, obey the rules, and care for your family, there will still be a place for you tomorrow. Collapse begins when those expectations fail all at once. Imagine a town after a major catastrophe. The market is closed because there is nothing left to sell. The wells are contaminated. The local officials have fled, or they are overwhelmed, or nobody believes them anymore. Messages stop arriving from outside. Rumours fill the silence. Someone says food is coming. Someone else says the roads are gone. Someone says the army is on its way. Someone else says the army is taking supplies for itself. And in an atmosphere like that, information becomes as valuable as bread. Maybe more valuable. A false rumour can send hundreds of people fleeing in the wrong direction. It can trigger panic at a water source. It can turn a crowd against a family accused of hoarding. When nobody knows what is true, people begin making decisions based on fear. And fear does not need much evidence. This is the human side of civilizational collapse. Not just death from the catastrophe itself, but the multiplication of danger after the first shock has passed. A failed harvest becomes famine because grain cannot be moved where it is needed. A damaged city becomes a death trap because clean water cannot be distributed. A temporary shortage becomes violence because people think someone else is taking more than their share. A frightened population becomes impossible to govern because every order sounds like a lie. The Kolbrin's catastrophe language, read as a moral and social warning, seems deeply concerned with this moment. The moment when fear overwhelms ordinary obligation, when people who once shared customs, laws, and sacred duties begin to see one another as competitors, threats, or prey. And that word matters. Prey. In comfortable times, predation can hide behind systems. The powerful exploit the weak through debt, corruption, unfair taxes, forced labour, or simple neglect. But when order breaks, exploitation becomes more visible and more immediate. Armed groups seize food. Local strongmen control wells and roads. Those with stockpiles hire guards. Those without them are pushed outward into hunger, exposure, and danger. It is tempting to imagine collapse as a great equalizer. A disaster strikes everyone, rich and poor, ruler and labourer, guilty and innocent. But history suggests something more complicated. Extreme pressure usually reveals the inequalities that already existed. People with land, kinship networks, stored food, useful skills, or social influence often have more options. People already isolated, indebted, displaced, sick, or poor are more likely to be trapped when the system fails. That is not a direct prediction from the Kolbrin, and no ancient text can explain every modern disaster. But it is one of the oldest truths in collapse narratives. The storm does not begin with everyone standing in the same place. Some are already on high ground, others are already drowning. If you want to go deeper into the strange ancient stories, lost civilizations, and unresolved questions behind warnings like this, our book on the 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website. The link is in the description. Now here is the part these stories often get wrong when people retell them. Panic is not inevitable. Human beings under pressure can become violent. That much is true. Scarcity, terror, displacement, and the absence of trusted authority can create conditions where terrible things happen. But communities in crisis can also become remarkably cooperative. Neighbours share food, families take in strangers, people organise rescues before officials arrive. Local networks improvise kitchens, shelters, clinics, and patrols. Those actions rarely become legends because they are less dramatic than chaos. But they are often what keeps a disaster from becoming total collapse. History gives us fragments of both possibilities. During sieges, famines, epidemics, and the breakdown of ancient states, there are records of hoarding, betrayal, flight, and violence. There are also records of mutual aid, religious communities feeding the hungry, villages rebuilding after floods, and families preserving children who were not their own. We should be careful not to force any one historical event into the Kolbrin's story. The text is not a documentary record of every crisis that came after it, but its central question fits many of them. What holds people together when the structures around them fail? Law helps, food helps, shelter helps, communication helps. But beneath all of those is trust. Trust that a shared water source will remain shared. Trust that a neighbour will not take advantage of your weakness. Trust that a leader is telling the truth. Trust that if you give something up today for the good of the group will still exist tomorrow. Without that, every person is pushed toward the same cold calculation. Take what you can, hide what you have, protect only your own, strike before someone strikes you. And once enough people begin living by that rule, the catastrophe no longer has to destroy civilization. The survivors will do it themselves. That may be the most unsettling idea buried inside these ancient warnings. Fire can destroy a city, flood can erase a harvest, earthquake can bring down a palace. But those things by themselves do not erase a people's ability to rebuild. What erases it is the loss of cooperation, the loss of memory, the loss of the belief that anyone beyond your own doorstep is worth saving. So what is the greatest danger in the Kolbrin's vision? The thing in the sky, the flood, the darkness, the breaking earth? Or is it what people become after they decide that mercy is a luxury, truth is useless, and survival belongs only to the strongest? Because if that is the real warning, then the first generation after the fall faces a problem even more difficult than staying alive. They have to become human again, and that brings us to the question at the centre of every collapse story. Who survives? Not who deserves to survive. Not who is strongest in ordinary times. Not who has the highest title, the biggest house, or the most gold locked behind the palace walls. Who is still standing after the sky has changed, the roads have failed, and the old world has become a memory. In the Kolbrin's Catastrophe passages, the answer is rarely the crowd. Again and again, The image is of a remnant, a small number of people who endure while the unprepared are overwhelmed. They are not necessarily kings. They are not always warriors. In fact, the text often treats power, wealth, and arrogance as dangerous illusions. The people who trusted most completely in the permanence of their world are the people least ready when that world disappears. The remnant survives because it sees danger before everyone else does. Or at least it takes danger seriously when everyone else is laughing. That distinction matters. Most civilizations do not collapse because nobody saw any warning signs. Warnings are usually everywhere. Crops fail, rivers change course. Leaders become corrupt, debt rises, violence spreads. The seasons become unreliable. People begin saying things like, "This has never happened before," even as the evidence piles up around them. The problem is not always a lack of information. It is the refusal to change. The Kolbrin survivors are often imagined as people who listen, people who prepare, people who do not confuse comfort with safety. They understand that a full granary can empty, a wall can fall, a ruler can flee, a familiar landscape can become unrecognizable in a single season. That is foresight, not supernatural knowledge, not necessarily a secret map to the future, just the difficult human ability to look at an unfolding danger and say, "This may be real." We need to act now, and acting now means discipline. The recurring survival logic in these ancient stories is almost painfully practical. Preserve what matters, store what can be stored, protect water, protect seed, protect food, protect tools, protect the young. Keep the knowledge needed to make fire, find shelter, heal wounds, grow crops, and rebuild homes. Because after catastrophe, wealth changes meaning. Gold cannot feed you. A throne cannot purify water. A beautiful temple cannot plant grain. But a bag of seed can become a future harvest. A skilled healer can keep a family alive. A person who knows where the springs are, how to repair a blade, how to preserve food, how to navigate by the stars, or how to settle a conflict before it becomes violence, may be worth more than all the treasures of the fallen city. This is why the remnant is not just a collection of isolated individuals. It is a community. One person can carry supplies, another can carry a child. One person can remember a route, another can build shelter. Someone has to hunt, someone has to tend the sick. Someone has to guard the water. Someone has to teach the children what the old world knew. Survival in the Kolbrin's broader moral imagination is never simply about being harder than everyone else. It is about remaining organized when organization has become almost impossible. Think about how fragile that is. A group may have food, but no trust. It may have weapons, but no discipline. It may have shelter, but no one willing to share it. It may have knowledge, but no way to pass it on. And then all those advantages begin to break apart. This is where the text's spiritual and ethical language becomes important. Its catastrophe stories are not written like modern emergency manuals. They are moral narratives. They connect survival with humility, obedience to higher law, restraint, truthfulness, and concern for others. The people who endure are often those who have not become intoxicated by their own power. They are the ones capable of recognizing limits. That does not mean the Kolbrin offers a simple formula. Be good, and disaster will pass over you. History does not work like that. Floods kill the kind and cruel alike. Disease does not check a person's moral record before it enters a village. Innocent people suffer in every real catastrophe, so we need to be careful. These passages should not be treated as reliable disaster preparedness instructions. They do not provide modern engineering, public health planning, evacuation strategy, climate science, or emergency communications. And they should never be used to blame victims for suffering through events beyond their control. But as a story about endurance, the remnant idea carries a different kind of truth. It asks what qualities make recovery possible after the first wave of destruction: foresight, discipline, cooperation, memory, the willingness to preserve essentials rather than waste everything on status, luxury, and conflict, and perhaps above all, the refusal to let fear destroy every obligation to other people. That is why remnant stories appear in so many cultures shaped by the fear of collapse. Flood stories, fire stories, stories of cities swallowed by the earth. Stories of a few families crossing a dead landscape with the seeds of a new world in their hands. They make catastrophe imaginable, but they also make continuation imaginable. When people face the possibility that everything familiar could vanish, they need to believe that something can pass through the darkness. A family, a law, a craft, a prayer, a handful of grain, a story told to a child who never saw the world before the fall. The remnant is not just a group of survivors, it is a bridge between the civilization that failed and the civilization that might come next. But surviving the end is only the beginning, because once the fire has gone out, once the waters have receded, once the last frightened families emerge from hiding, they face an even harder question. What do you do with the world that remains? The first generation after the fall does not wake up in a new civilization. It wakes up in ruins, and ruins are not empty. They are dangerous. A collapsed city may still contain food stores, tools, shelter, and water. But it may also contain fire, unstable buildings, contaminated wells, dead bodies, disease, desperate strangers, and the kind of fear that makes ordinary people do things they would never have imagined before. This is the part catastrophe stories often move through too quickly. The sky burns, the earth shakes, the waters rise. Then somehow survivors begin again. But beginning again is not one moment. It is thousands of small decisions made by exhausted people who may have lost almost everything. Who gets the last clean water? Who guards the children at night? Who goes back into the old settlement to search for grain? Who decides whether a stranger is welcomed into camp or driven away? Who has the authority to settle an argument when the old authority is gone? These are the questions waiting after the disaster. And the Kolbrin's larger vision of collapse seems to understand this. Its warnings are not only about destruction coming from the heavens or from the earth. They are about what happens to people when the structures that held their lives together suddenly disappear. Laws, markets, temples, rulers, family networks, harvest schedules, familiar boundaries between friend and enemy. All of it can be gone faster than anyone expects before the fall food arrives through systems so ordinary that most people barely notice them. Fields are planted, animals are tended, roads are maintained. Storehouses are guarded. People know which family bakes bread, which village has the best well, which merchant brings salt before winter. After the fall, though systems may be broken, a field cannot feed anyone if the people who knew how to plant it are dead, displaced, injured, or scattered. Seed grain may have been eaten in the first desperate weeks. Irrigation channels may be blocked, draft animals may be gone. Tools may be buried beneath rubble. Even if the rains return and the soil is still fertile, a harvest takes time. And time is exactly what hungry people do not have. So the first survivors would likely live from whatever they could salvage, hunt, gather, trade, or steal. They would search abandoned homes, they would follow rivers. They would look for wild plants, edible roots, stranded animals, anything that could carry them through one more day. But short-term survival can destroy long-term recovery. Eat all the seed, and there may be nothing to plant. Cut down every tree for one cold season, and there may be no timber left for rebuilding. Take water from an unprotected source, and sickness can spread through the camp. That is the brutal logic of the first generation. Every choice is urgent. Every choice has consequences that may not appear until months later. Safety becomes another problem. In a functioning society, people often assume someone else is responsible for protection. There are guards at gates, neighbours nearby, rules against theft, some form of authority to call on when violence begins. After a collapse, that confidence evaporates. A family sleeping beside a small fire may not know who is approaching through the dark. A group with food may become a target. A village that preserved grain may have to decide whether to share it, hide it, or defend it. And none of those choices are simple, because scarcity changes the emotional temperature of every human relationship. It can create extraordinary generosity. People who have almost nothing may still divide food among strangers. Parents may care for orphaned children. Skilled people may teach others without expecting payment. A group may realize that its only real wealth is the number of hands willing to work together. This is not fantasy. Mutual aid appears again and again in real disasters. When official systems fail, neighbours often become the first rescuers. They carry the injured, share shelter, cook together, search for the missing, create order before formal authority returns. But scarcity can also produce the opposite. It can turn every storehouse into a battlefield. When fear becomes stronger than trust, people stop seeing others as neighbours and begin seeing them as competitors. The stranger has one more mouth to feed. The traveller may be a thief. The neighbouring settlement may have water your settlement needs. A disagreement over land, livestock, or a hidden cache of grain can become the beginning of a feud that lasts for generations. This is one of the darkest implications in collapse literature. The catastrophe does not end when the flood recedes. It continues inside the survivors. The people who come through may carry trauma they do not have words for. Children may grow up hearing screams in the night, seeing adults panic at storms, watching parents hide food even when there is enough. They may inherit not only stories of the old world, but its terror. Imagine being born after the disaster. You have never seen the city as it was. You only know it as broken walls on the horizon. Your parents speak of markets, festivals, laws, and harvests, so abundant that grain spilled on the ground. But to you, that world sounds almost impossible, like a story about giants. And the adults around you are carrying grief. They lost parents, brothers, children, homes, entire communities. Some may become more protective, more disciplined, more committed to rebuilding. Others may become suspicious, violent, or unable to trust anyone beyond their immediate family. Without stable institutions, trauma has nowhere to go. There may be no court to settle disputes, no temple or council trusted by everyone. No school to teach children a shared history. No regular system for distributing food. No recognized leader whose decisions will be accepted when those decisions are painful. So local authority has to be built from almost nothing. Maybe the authority belongs to the oldest survivor because they remember how things used to work. Maybe it belongs to the strongest fighter because protection is desperately needed. Maybe it belongs to the person who controls the well, the seed store, the tools, or the route to safety. But each of those arrangements carries danger. The strongest protector can become a tyrant. The keeper of food can become a hoarder. The elder who preserves memory can also preserve old hatreds. This is why rebuilding is not only a material challenge, it is a moral test. Can survivors create rules before violence becomes normal? Can they share enough to keep the weak alive without exhausting everything the group has? Can they punish theft without turning punishment into revenge? Can they give authority to someone without allowing that authority to become another form of domination? The Kolbrin does not offer a detailed blueprint for answering those questions. It is not a constitution for a post-disaster settlement, but its moral world keeps returning to the same warning. A civilization can be destroyed by more than fire, flood, or darkness. It can also be destroyed by the human response to fear. The first generation of survivors stands at a crossroads. One path leads toward cooperation, shared labour, protected seed, repaired wells, rules that apply even when nobody is watching. Children taught not only how the old world died, but how a better one might live. The other path leads toward hoarding, vengeance, and the worship of force. Small groups fighting over the remains, leaders using danger to make themselves untouchable, people repeating the same arrogance and cruelty that, in the story's moral logic, helped bring the first civilization down. And that is the real terror of the aftermath. Not that nothing survives, but that enough survives to begin again, and no one has learned what must change. But there is another problem waiting behind food, water, shelter, and safety. Knowledge. A civilization does not live only in its buildings. It lives in the minds of the people who know how to make those buildings stand. It lives in the farmer who understands when to plant, the healer who recognizes which fever can be treated and which water will make everyone sick, the craft worker who can turn ore into metal, clay into storage jars, fibers into rope, timber into a roof, the navigator who remembers the safe road through the mountains, the midwife, the mason, the engineer, the teacher, the person who knows how to repair a broken wheel, preserve food through winter, read a map, calculate a season, or settle an argument without starting a blood feud. Lose enough of those people, and the survivors may still have the ruins of a civilization around them. But they no longer have the civilization itself. This is one of the hardest things to understand about collapse. A ruined city can make the past look close. You can see the walls. You can walk through the streets. You can find tools, inscriptions, storehouses, machines, books. But seeing an object is not the same as knowing how to make it. A survivor might find a metal tool and use it for years without understanding how metal was smelted. They might live beside the remains of an aqueduct without knowing how its gradients were measured, how its channels were sealed, or how thousands of workers were organized to build it. They might inherit a written language but lose the ability to read it within a few generations. If there are no schools, no scribes, no stable institutions, and no time to teach. That is how recovery becomes slower than people expect. The survivors do not simply pick up where their ancestors left off. They may have to rediscover skills their ancestors considered ordinary. How do you make soap? How do you preserve grain from insects? How do you make medicine from plants without poisoning the patient? How do you make glass? How do you make ink? How do you turn raw iron into a reliable blade? How do you build a bridge that does not collapse the first time a flood comes through? These things seem small when a society has specialists. They become enormous when the specialists are gone. And literacy is especially fragile. Writing can look permanent. Words carved into stone may survive for thousands of years. Books can outlast dynasties. Tablets can lie buried in the ground until someone uncovers them centuries later. But a text is only useful if someone can read it. And someone can only read it if another person taught them how. That is the chain. One generation teaches the next. A parent teaches a child, a scribe trains an apprentice. An elder repeats a story until it becomes part of the group's memory. A school preserves language, numbers, records, law, history, and technical skill. Break that chain for long enough, and even a library becomes silent. The books remain, the meaning disappears. This is why ancient disaster traditions so often give special importance to scribes, priests, elders, lawgivers, and survivors who remember. In these stories, the guardian of memory is not just a scholar sitting safely away from the crisis. They are part of the survival effort. They may be the person who remembers where the clean springs are. They may know which seeds must be saved. They may preserve the names of families, the boundaries of land, the old agreements between clans. They may know the calendar. They may remember the warning signs before a flood. They may carry songs, rituals, and stories that hold a shattered group together when there is no written law and no trusted government left. And that last part matters. Knowledge is not only technical, it is also social. A community needs to know how to grow food, but it also needs to know how to cooperate long enough to grow it. It needs rules for sharing water, customs that limit revenge, stories that tell people why they should protect children who are not their own, memories of past disasters that warn against building in the wrong place, trusting the wrong leader, or believing that prosperity will last forever. In that sense, memory can be a kind of shelter, not a shelter from rain or cold, a shelter from repeating the same mistake. And this brings us back to the Kolbrin itself. Whatever one concludes about its disputed origins and complicated publication history, the book presents itself as something preserved across catastrophe and time. It claims to carry memories from an older world forward into a later one. Egyptian material, Celtic material, warnings, moral teachings, disaster imagery, fragments of a past that may otherwise have been lost. That claimed preservation story is deeply connected to the message people find in the text. The Kolbrin is concerned with destruction, yes, fire in the sky, darkness, flood, upheaval, human arrogance before disaster, human fear after it. But it is also concerned with what remains. Not just who remains, what remains. Which stories survive when cities do not? Which warnings survive when governments do not? Which names, skills, laws, and hard-won lessons pass through the narrow opening between one age and the next? That is why the Keeper of Knowledge can become one of the most important figures in any collapse story. Not because they know everything, nobody does, but because they understand that forgetting has consequences. Imagine a settlement 50 years after the fall. The children born after the disaster are now adults. The ruins are still there, but fewer people remember what the old world was really like. The stories have already changed. Some details have been exaggerated. Others have been softened because they were too painful to repeat. A warning becomes a legend. A lesson becomes a ritual. A name becomes a god. And somewhere in that settlement, an old woman or an aging teacher keeps saying, "No, that is not how it happened. The river rose after the ground shook. Do not build there. Save grain for planting. Boil the water. Do not trust a leader who says the rules no longer apply to him. Teach the children to read." Those instructions may sound unglamorous compared to prophecies of a destroyer in the heavens. But they may be more important because the battle after collapse is not only against hunger, cold, disease, and violence, it is against amnesia. And if our own institutions vanished tomorrow, what knowledge would matter most? Would it be the knowledge stored in distant servers, locked behind passwords, dependent on electricity and networks that no longer exist? Or would it be the knowledge one person can carry, explain, demonstrate, and pass to another person by firelight? How to find water, how to make it safe, how to grow food, how to treat wounds, how to build shelter, how to preserve seeds, how to make tools, how to read, how to count, how to cooperate, and maybe, above all, how to remember why the previous world fell. But remembering why the previous world fell creates an even harder question. What if people remember the disaster, but forget the behaviour that made them vulnerable to it? What if they preserve the story of the flood, the fire, the darkness, the destroyer in the sky, but not the quieter warning hidden underneath? Do not let greed rule the storehouses. Do not let power gather in the hands of people who believe they are beyond consequence. Do not build a society so unequal that some people can survive any crisis, while others are one failed harvest away from death. Do not mistake comfort for wisdom. This is where the Kolbrin's warning becomes more disturbing than a simple end-time story. Most apocalypse stories end at the moment of destruction. The sky burns, the cities fall, the wicked are punished. A few people survive. Then the story stops, as if surviving automatically makes humanity better. But survival does not automatically make anyone wise. A person can live through a disaster and come out more compassionate. They can understand how fragile life is. They can share food because they remember hunger. They can protect strangers because someone once protected them. They can refuse to follow cruel leaders because they know what cruelty costs. Or they can come out terrified. And terrified people do not always build gentle societies. Sometimes trauma makes people cling to control. Sometimes it makes them suspicious of outsiders. Sometimes it turns every disagreement into a threat, every shortage into a reason to hoard, every unfamiliar group into an enemy. A community that has barely escaped famine may become obsessed with storing grain. That sounds sensible. It is sensible at first, but then imagine who controls the grain. Imagine one family, one temple, one warlord, one council deciding who eats and who does not. Imagine survival knowledge becoming a source of authority. The person who knows where the water is, where the seeds are hidden, how to read the old records, suddenly has power over everyone else. And power has a way of changing the meaning of survival. At first, the rules may exist to keep the community alive. Ration food, guard the wells, organize labour, punish theft. Make sure everyone does their part. But over time, rules designed for crisis can become permanent. The emergency ends, but the hierarchy remains. The leader, who was given authority for one terrible winter, decides he should keep it forever. The guards who protected the grain stores begin taking the best share for themselves. The people at the bottom are told that sacrifice is necessary, while the people at the top somehow never have to sacrifice quite as much. That is how a new civilization can begin carrying the old civilization's poison in its blood. Not because the survivors are uniquely evil, because the pressures are real. Food is scarce. Security is uncertain. Children need protecting. The future is unclear. In that kind of world, domination can look like order. Exploitation can disguise itself as necessity. Violence can be called justice. And anyone who questions the arrangement can be accused of endangering everyone. The Kolbrin, read as a moral warning rather than a literal historical record, keeps returning to this pattern. Human beings face catastrophe, but catastrophe is never only something that happens to them. Pride, corruption, injustice and blindness are part of the landscape too. The disaster may come from beyond human control. A flood does not care whether a king is honest. An earthquake does not choose its victims according to their moral character. But the way a society responds before and after the disaster is profoundly human. Who was allowed to prepare? Who had access to food? Who received warnings? Who was ignored? Who was protected? Who was left outside the gates? Those questions do not disappear when the old world ends. They become even more important, because after collapse, everything is being decided again. Who owns the land? Who speaks for the dead? Who keeps the weapons? Who teaches the children? Who gets to say what the disaster meant? That last question may be the most powerful of all. If the survivors decide the old world fell because people were too free, they may build a harsher world. If they decide it fell because outsiders were dangerous, they may build walls and turn fear into law. If they decide it fell because the gods demanded obedience, they may place sacred authority beyond challenge. But if they decide the old world fell partly because wealth, power, and knowledge were concentrated in too few hands, then they might build differently. They might spread knowledge instead of guarding it. They might create rules that restrain leaders instead of worshipping them. They might make sure food reserves belong to the community, not to whoever happens to hold the keys. That is the opportunity hidden inside renewal. A collapsed civilization leaves behind emptiness. But emptiness is not the same thing as freedom. The old structures may be gone, the old palaces may be burned. The old laws may no longer be enforceable, but old habits can survive in the people themselves. A king can die, and the desire for kings can remain. A prison can collapse, and people can rebuild one. A system of exploitation can vanish with the cities that supported it, only to return when one group discovers it can make another group work for less, eat less, own less, and fear more. This is why the real warning is not, civilization will fall once. It is, civilization may keep falling in different forms. A society rises, it becomes organized, it becomes wealthy. It develops specialists, laws, armies, trade, monuments, records. It begins by solving problems, then slowly, it may begin creating new ones. Wealth pools at the top. Leaders become insulated from consequences. The people doing the hardest work have the least protection. Warnings are dismissed because they are inconvenient. The system grows more impressive and more fragile at the same time. Then comes the shock. Drought, war, disease, environmental collapse, financial breakdown, famine, a disaster from the sky, if you are reading the Kolbrin through its own terrifying imagery. And afterward the survivors rebuild. But rebuild what? That is the question. Not whether they can stack stones into walls again. Not whether they can plant fields, reopen roads, establish markets, or raise a new generation beneath new laws. The question is whether they will build a civilization that has learned anything, or whether, given enough time, enough prosperity, and enough distance from the original suffering, they will recreate the same inequalities, the same arrogance, the same violence, and the same blindness that made the last world so fragile. Maybe the final disaster is not the fire, the flood, or the falling darkness. Maybe it is the moment survivors look at the ruins of the old age, swear never again, and then begin building the same world with different names. And once you start asking that question, you notice something strange. The Kolbrin is not alone. Across the ancient world, people told stories about a world that had gone terribly wrong. A time when human beings became violent, corrupt, arrogant, forgetful, or simply too numerous for the order of things to hold. Then came the judgment or the disaster or the great turning of the age. Water rose, fire fell, the earth shook, the sky changed. Cities vanished, a small number of people survived, and from them the world began again. In Mesopotamia, the oldest known versions of the flood story appear thousands of years before the Hebrew Bible. In the epic of Gilgamesh, a man named Utnapishtim is warned that the gods intend to destroy humanity with a flood. He builds a huge boat. He takes family, animals, supplies, and the seed of life. The waters come, the old world is erased. When the flood finally ends, the survivors step out into a changed world. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah receives a similar warning. Humanity has become corrupt and violent. God commands Noah to build an ark. He saves his family and pairs of animals while the flood destroys the rest. Then comes the covenant, the promise that the world will continue, but under a new moral relationship between humanity and the divine. In Greece, there is Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides humanity has become wicked and sends a flood. Deucalion survives in a chest or ark-like vessel. When the waters recede, he and Pyrrha repopulate the world in one of the strangest renewal stories ever told. They throw stones behind them, and those stones become new human beings. In India, the story of Manu tells of a great flood too. Manu is warned by a fish, often understood as an avatar of Vishnu. He builds a boat, survives the waters, and preserves the seeds of life for the world to come. And these are only the famous examples. Flood traditions appear among indigenous peoples in the Americas, among cultures in East Asia, across the Pacific Islands, in Australia, Africa, and Europe. Some describe a god's punishment. Some describe a natural disaster. Some describe the ending of one age and the beginning of another. But again and again, the basic shape returns. Humanity falls out of balance. Destruction comes. A few survive. The world is renewed. Now, this is exactly the point where people can get carried away. They look at all these stories and say, there must have been one single global flood. One planet-wide catastrophe remembered by every culture on Earth. But similarities alone do not prove that human beings have always lived beside rivers, coasts, lakes, and seasonal floodplains. The places where early civilizations grew are often the same places most vulnerable to destructive water. The Tigris and Euphrates could flood. The Nile could fail or overflow. Monsoon systems could turn deadly. Coastal communities could be hit by storms, tsunamis, and rising seas. A flood that destroyed one valley might feel like the destruction of the entire world to the people living there. And for them it was. If your city, your fields, your temples, your family, and every road you know disappear beneath water, you do not need a planet-wide event to believe the world has ended. Your world has ended. There is also cultural contact. Stories travel. Traders carry them. Migrants carry them. Priests, soldiers, captives, and scribes carry them. A myth can cross mountains and deserts more easily than we sometimes imagine, changing names and gods as it goes. The Mesopotamian flood traditions may have influenced later stories in the Near East. That does not make every version identical, but it means ancient people were not isolated islands, inventing every idea from nothing. Then there is something even deeper. Maybe flood stories recur because water is the perfect image of helplessness. You cannot argue with a river that has left its banks. You cannot negotiate with a storm surge. You cannot arrest the sea. Water ignores walls, crosses borders, enters homes, carries away possessions, and turns the familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. It destroys, but it also cleanses. It takes life, but it leaves fertile mud behind. It is terror and renewal in the same force. That makes it ideal for stories about moral collapse. A flood can become more than weather. It can become a picture of everything humanity fears: chaos returning, order dissolving, the powerful brought low, the hidden exposed, the old world washed away. But the Kolbrin does something different. Its central catastrophe image is not simply water rising around a boat. It is the destroyer, a terrifying presence associated with the heavens. Fire, smoke, darkness, blood-coloured skies, earthquakes, upheaval, and a world thrown out of order. Depending on how it is interpreted, the language can sound like a comet, a celestial body, volcanic disaster, atmospheric chaos, or the symbolic vocabulary of apocalypse. The text does include flood-like destruction and overwhelming natural violence. But its nightmare is larger than a standard flood narrative. The danger comes from above. That matters in most flood stories. Survival depends on refuge. Build the ark, climb the mountain, preserve the seeds. Wait for the waters to fall. In the Kolbrin's catastrophe imagery, there may be nowhere that feels fully safe. The sky itself becomes hostile. Darkness arrives when light should be there. The earth trembles beneath people's feet. Fire and water become part of the same unravelling. It is not just a flood destroying a corrupt city. It is creation itself seeming to malfunction. And that gives the Kolbrin a different emotional force. A flood tells you that nature can overwhelm human plans. The destroyer tells you that the entire system you trusted may be more fragile than you thought. The sky, the seasons, the ground, the rulers, the storehouses, the old certainties, all of it can fail at once. That does not prove the Kolbrin preserves a literal memory of one ancient global cataclysm. Its origins, dating and transmission remain disputed. Its language may combine older themes with later religious imagination, but its power does not depend on proving every image was eyewitness history. Because the fear behind it is real, every civilization knows, somewhere beneath its confidence, that it is standing on conditions it did not create and cannot completely control. The rivers can change, the climate can shift, the crops can fail. The ground can move, the sky can darken, and when people tell stories about floods, fires, darkness, and the end of an age, they may not all be remembering the same disaster. They may be remembering the same truth, that the world feels permanent right up until the moment it does not. So if ancient catastrophe stories are not automatic proof of one lost global disaster, what can science actually tell us? Quite a lot. Just not always what people want it to say. Geology, archaeology, astronomy and climate science all preserve different pieces of the same enormous record. Not a record written in words, but in rock layers, ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, crater scars, broken cities, buried villages, chemical traces, fossils and DNA. The planet has memory. It just speaks a language that takes years to learn how to read. And that record is clear about one thing. Catastrophe is real. Not metaphorical catastrophe. Not just the emotional collapse of an old order. Real events have repeatedly transformed landscapes, killed populations, disrupted food systems, ended settlements, and forced survivors to begin again under conditions they did not choose. Start with impacts from space. Earth has been struck before, and it will be struck again. Most incoming objects burn harmlessly in the atmosphere. Some explode in the air like the object over Chelyabinsk, Russia, in 2013, which injured more than 1,000 people, mostly through shattered glass. But larger impacts can be unimaginably destructive. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The Chicxulub impact was not the only cause of change at the end of the age of dinosaurs, but it was a devastating one. It blasted dust, sulfur, soot and debris high into the atmosphere. Sunlight was reduced, food chains collapsed, a huge share of species disappeared. That is not mythology. It is written into the geology of the Earth in a thin layer rich in iridium, an element rare in the crust, but more common in meteorites. It is visible in shocked minerals, impact debris, and the crater itself. But here is the important distinction. The fact that impacts happen does not prove that every ancient description of a fiery object in the sky is an impact memory. Ancient people saw comets, meteors, eclipses, auroras, and unusual storms. They had powerful language for heavenly terror because the sky was powerful. A red comet might become an omen. A meteor shower might become a dragon, a sword, a destroyer, or the wrath of a god. The observation can be real without the explanation being modern science. Then there are volcanoes. A major eruption can turn noon into darkness. It can cover fields in ash, poison water supplies, destroy harvests, trigger mud flows and alter climate far beyond the mountain itself. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia with such force that the following year became known in parts of Europe and North America as the year without a summer. Frost struck during warm months, crops failed, food prices rose, hunger followed. Imagine living through that without weather satellites, atmospheric measurements or global maps. The sun seems weaker, summer fails, strange skies appear. Snow falls at the wrong time. The world does not merely feel damaged, it feels cursed. The eruption of Thera or Santorini in the Bronze Age may have been one of the largest volcanic events of the ancient Mediterranean world. It devastated the island and generated tsunamis. Researchers still debate exactly how it affected Minoan civilization and how closely it may connect to later traditions. But it gives us a realistic model for how one eruption could become a generational memory of fire, darkness, waves, and a world suddenly overturned. Earthquakes offer another kind of terror. They arrive with almost no warning. One moment a city is standing. The next, walls split apart, roads buckle, fires spread, and the ground itself becomes unreliable. Archaeologists have found ancient settlements with collapsed structures, abandoned districts, and rebuilding phases that may reflect seismic destruction. But archaeology has to be careful. A ruined wall does not automatically prove an earthquake. Fire, war, erosion, and simple age can leave similar evidence. That caution matters. Science is strongest when it says, here is what the evidence supports. Here is what remains possible. Here is what we do not yet know. Floods, meanwhile, have shaped human history from the beginning. Rivers build civilizations by bringing water and fertile soil. They also destroy them. Sudden river floods, failed dams, storm surges, tsunamis, glacial lake outbursts, and sea level rise have all displaced communities. After the last ice age, melting glaciers raised global sea levels by more than 100 meters over thousands of years. Coastlines moved inward. Low-lying lands disappeared. Communities living near ancient shores would have watched familiar territory vanish, perhaps slowly over generations, perhaps violently during storms and regional surges. And then there is climate. Civilizations depend on patterns. Rains come when expected. Rivers rise within a range people understand. Winters are hard but survivable. Crops can be planted with some confidence. When those patterns shift, even slowly, the consequences can be brutal. Long droughts have contributed to famine, migration, conflict, and political breakdown in many regions. Abrupt cooling events have shortened growing seasons. Changes in monsoon systems have weakened agricultural societies. The collapse of a civilization is rarely caused by one thing alone. It is usually a chain reaction. Drought reduces harvests. Food prices rise. Governments lose legitimacy. Conflict spreads. Disease follows weakened populations. Trade fails. Cities become harder to supply. And disease belongs in this story too. Pandemics are catastrophes because they attack the network that makes civilization work. They empty farms, workshops, armies, ports and households. They create fear between neighbours. They can weaken states already under pressure from war, climate stress, or economic failure. Modern genetics and archaeology can sometimes detect ancient pathogens, but the evidence is incomplete. We know disease has repeatedly changed history. We do not always know exactly how much it changed any one ancient collapse. That is the scientific picture, not one single destroyer. Not one universal date when every culture watched the same planet-wide nightmare unfold. Instead, a world full of real hazards, impacts, eruptions, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, pandemics, droughts, abrupt climate shifts, events capable of destroying a village, a kingdom, or an entire way of life. And suddenly the ancient stories become easier to understand. They do not need to be technical reports to contain truth. A people fleeing ashfall may describe the sky as burning. A community shattered by an earthquake may say the foundations of the world broke apart. Survivors of famine may remember the sun as failing them. People facing floodwater, darkness and panic may tell their children that chaos had returned. Those are not scientific explanations, they are human explanations. They tell us what catastrophe felt like from inside it. The Kolbrin's language of celestial terror, fire, darkness, upheaval, and social collapse should not be used as evidence for speculative claims that a hidden planet, recurring cosmic object, or imminent global destroyer is about to strike Earth. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. Astronomers track near-Earth objects. Geologists study impact records. Climate scientists model changing systems. Risk assessment is based on observations, data, probabilities, and uncertainty made explicit. That is very different from taking a frightening ancient passage and treating it like a coded forecast. But science does not have to mock the story to reject the prophecy. In fact, science can make its warning more serious. Because the danger was never that an old manuscript could predict the exact date of the end. The danger is that real systems can fail, that civilizations can become dependent on stable conditions, that people can mistake normality for permanence, and that when disaster comes, the survivors are not judged by whether they understood every cause. They are judged by what they prepared, what they preserved, and whether they still knew how to help one another when the world changed. And that brings us to a strange modern transformation. How did a text filled with catastrophe, exile, fire in the sky, and the collapse of kingdoms become, for some readers, a literal warning about the next apocalypse? The answer has less to do with what the text can actually prove, and more to do with what people fear. For decades, the Kolbrin has been pulled into a growing universe of end-time speculation. Its image of the destroyer, the terrifying object associated with fire, darkness, upheaval and disaster, was linked by modern writers to comets, then to asteroid impacts, then to rogue planets, then to pole shifts, then to the idea that some enormous hidden body was moving through the solar system, returning on a secret cycle to devastate Earth. You may have heard some version of this before. A planet called Nibiru, Planet X, a brown dwarf hidden beyond detection, a wandering world about to pass near Earth, a cosmic object that governments supposedly know about, but refuse to reveal. Every few years the date changes, the object changes, the evidence changes, but the pattern stays the same. A warning has been found. Experts are lying. The deadline is near. And this time, supposedly, the ancient texts predicted it all. The Kolbrin became useful to these theories because its language is dramatic and flexible. A destroyer in the heavens can be made to sound like almost anything. A comet, a planet, an asteroid, a magnetic reversal, a solar event, a symbol of divine judgment. Once a passage is removed from its larger setting, once its uncertain history is ignored, a few lines can be made to carry almost any message someone wants them to carry. That is how prophecy culture works. It starts with a real human anxiety. Then it finds a text old enough, strange enough, and frightening enough to make that anxiety feel ancient. And once the fear has been given an ancient voice, it can feel more convincing than evidence. Think about the periods when these ideas spread most easily. Political instability, wars, economic crashes, environmental crisis, new diseases, rapid technological change, the feeling that familiar institutions are failing, the feeling that powerful people know more than ordinary people. the feeling that the future is arriving too fast to understand. Under those conditions, hidden text narratives become incredibly appealing. They offer a simple explanation for a complicated world. Maybe the chaos is not random. Maybe someone saw it coming. Maybe the warning was preserved for us. Maybe the people in power buried the truth. Maybe the disaster has a name, a date, and a single cause. That can be frightening, but it can also feel comforting, because uncertainty is hard to live with. A real world of overlapping risks is messy. Climate change has no single villain. Political breakdown has no single switch. A pandemic does not arrive because one secret group failed to read one manuscript. Civilization is vulnerable because millions of systems depend on one another. Food, energy, water, transport, trust, public health, communication, and cooperation. That is complicated. A hidden planet is simpler. It turns fear into a story with a clear enemy. And the internet made that story spread faster than ever. A sentence is copied from a website. The website copied it from a forum. The forum copied it from a self-published book. The book may have quoted a translation without naming it, shortened a passage, changed a word, or blended the Kolbrin with biblical verses, Egyptian myths, Mayan calendar claims, and theories about Nibiru. By the time the quotation reaches a video, a social media post, or an alarming headline, it may no longer resemble its original context at all. Words like destroyer, red sky, darkness, and earthquake are presented as if they were technical astronomical data. Metaphor becomes measurement. A catastrophic image becomes an orbital calculation. A disputed text becomes a classified report from the ancient world. And the audience is told not to ask too many questions. That is one of the clearest warning signs. Sensational interpretations tend to speak with absolute certainty where the evidence is weakest. They announce exact dates. They claim astronomers have discovered an object but are hiding it. They treat the absence of evidence as proof of a cover-up. They say every eclipse, meteor, storm, earthquake, or unusual sunset confirms the prediction. And when the predicted date passes without disaster, the theory does not end. It adapts. The date was calculated wrong. The object changed course. The event was delayed. The prophecy was spiritual, not physical. The warning continues because the fear continues. None of that means a person cannot find personal meaning in the Kolbrin's imagery. Ancient catastrophe stories can speak powerfully to people living through unstable times. The destroyer can represent arrogance, environmental damage, war, greed, the fragility of order, or the terrifying fact that nature does not negotiate with human pride. Those are meaningful interpretations. They may even be useful ones. But personal meaning is not the same thing as scientific prediction. The Kolbrin does not provide evidence that a hidden planet is approaching Earth. It does not establish a timetable for apocalypse, and no ancient passage, however vivid, can replace astronomy, geology, historical research, or the hard work of checking claims against reality. The deeper reason this text became prophecy is not that it gave modern people a reliable map of the future. It is that it gave them a language for a feeling many already had, the feeling that the world is more fragile than it looks. And on that point, the warning does not need a rogue planet to be true. But that raises the question we have to ask before we go any further. What exactly is the Kolbrin Bible? Not what do people say it is. Not what do internet videos claim it predicted. Not what it might mean if its stories preserve some distant memory of disaster. What can actually be established? This is where the story becomes much less comfortable and much more interesting, because the Kolbrin is surrounded by claims of enormous antiquity. Some versions describe part of it as Egyptian material preserved from the ancient world. Other portions are said to carry Celtic or British traditions passed down through religious communities. There are stories of manuscripts rescued from fire, hidden from authorities, copied in secret, and preserved across centuries until they finally emerged in modern form. It is a dramatic origin story, but a dramatic origin story is not the same thing as a documented one. The central problem is provenance, that is, the chain of custody of an object or document. Where did it come from? Who possessed it? When was it acquired? Where has it been stored? Can independent researchers examine the physical manuscript? Can they compare its ink, paper, binding, handwriting, and language to materials from the period it is claimed to come from? With the Kolbrin, those questions become difficult very quickly. The text circulated publicly in modern editions, but the ancient source manuscripts behind its most extraordinary claims are not available for broad, independent scholarly examination in the way historians would expect. There is no widely accepted archive of verified Egyptian originals, no securely documented medieval manuscript tradition that researchers can trace, page by page, through catalogues, collections, and institutions. No established body of peer-reviewed scholarship confirming that the books, in their present form, came down intact from ancient Egypt or early Celtic Britain. That does not automatically prove that every line is modern. But it does mean the strongest claims cannot be treated as established history. Think about how authentication normally works. Suppose someone discovers a manuscript and says it was written 2,000 years ago. Historians do not begin by asking whether its message is profound. They begin with the object itself. What is it written on? Papyrus? Parchment? Paper? What kind of ink was used? Does the handwriting match scripts known from that place and time? Does the grammar fit the claimed language period? Or does it contain later words, later spellings, later ideas? Can carbon dating provide a range for the material? Can other specialists inspect it independently? Can its contents be compared with texts already known from ancient archives? And perhaps most important, does the evidence hold up when the people examining it have no personal investment in the result? That is not academic snobbery. That is how we separate an ancient document from a modern composition written in an ancient style. A text can sound old without being old. It can use biblical language, Egyptian imagery, archaic phrases, disaster mythology, kings, prophets, sacred laws, lost manuscripts, and hidden knowledge. It can feel like it belongs to a vanished world. But style is not a time machine. Anyone familiar with religious literature, mythology, and historical fiction can create words that sound ancient. And the Kolbrin has features that make scholars cautious. Its publication history is unclear in places. Its translation history is not securely mapped. The supposed original language texts are not generally accessible for detailed linguistic comparison. Claims about how the material was preserved differ depending on who is telling the story, and major institutions specializing in Egyptology, ancient manuscripts, Celtic studies, and biblical literature have not broadly recognized the Kolbrin as a verified ancient source. That matters, because if a collection truly preserved unknown Egyptian writings or early British records of immense historical importance, it would be one of the greatest manuscript discoveries in generations. Specialists would be studying it intensely. There would be photographs, catalogue records, material analysis, competing translations, conferences, articles, arguments over grammar, arguments over dating, arguments over whether one damaged word means comet or king, or something else entirely. Real ancient texts create arguments, lots of them. But those arguments happen around evidence that can be inspected. The responsible position is not that the Kolbrin must be meaningless, because its provenance is disputed. That would be too simple. Literary value and evidentiary value are not the same thing. A story can be powerful without being ancient. A warning can be psychologically true without being historically literal. A text can reveal what modern readers fear, what they long for, and what kinds of disasters they believe civilization can survive, even if it cannot tell us what happened in ancient Egypt thousands of years ago. The Kolbrin's images remain compelling because they speak in a language human beings understand immediately. A proud society ignores warnings, order breaks down, nature becomes terrifying, families scatter, knowledge is lost. A few people survive, and they must decide what kind of world to build next. That is a real pattern in human history, not because one disputed manuscript proves it, but because collapse, migration, war, famine, disaster, and recovery have shaped civilizations again and again. So what can we claim? We can say the Kolbrin is a modernly circulated collection presented as containing ancient material. We can say its catastrophe imagery has attracted readers searching for lost history and future warnings. We can say its manuscript history and claimed origins remain disputed and unverified by the standards required for extraordinary historical claims. And we can say that no responsible reading should treat it as confirmed evidence of a recurring cosmic destroyer, a hidden planet, or a literal timetable for the end of civilization. That uncertainty is not the end of the investigation. It is the beginning of a better one. Because once we stop asking, is this secret prophecy definitely true? We can ask deeper questions. Why do catastrophe stories survive? Why do people keep imagining that knowledge was lost before? Why are we drawn to warnings from forgotten civilizations? And what if the most important thing in the Kolbrin is not whether every claimed origin can be proven? What if the real warning begins with the fact that we are so eager to believe that someone, somewhere, already knew how our world might end? And that brings us to the most useful way to read a text like the Kolbrin. Not as a countdown, not as a secret astronomical forecast, not as proof that a hidden object is moving through space, waiting to return on a date somebody has calculated from obscure passages and internet speculation, but as a meditation on fragility, because civilizations are fragile, not in the sense that they can disappear overnight for no reason. Most do not. They weaken slowly. Their institutions lose trust. Their resources become strained. Their leaders become detached from ordinary people. Information gets distorted. Neighbours become rivals. Short-term survival starts mattering more than long-term responsibility. Then something happens. Maybe it is a drought, a flood, a disease outbreak, war, financial collapse, crop failure, a major earthquake, a chain of failures in systems everyone assumed would always work. And suddenly the strength of a society is tested. The Kolbrin's catastrophe imagery is dramatic because it puts all of that pressure into one terrifying picture. Fire in the sky, darkness, floodwaters, the earth shaking, cities falling. The old order broken beyond repair. Whether those images preserve ancient memories, modern religious imagination, or some mixture of both, they point toward a truth that does not require literal prophecy. Human beings live inside systems we did not build alone and cannot maintain alone. The food in a city arrives because thousands of people cooperate. Clean water reaches homes because engineers, workers, institutions, and public trust all keep functioning. Hospitals depend on power, transport, supplies, trained staff, and communication. Knowledge survives because people teach it, record it, protect it, and pass it on to someone else. Civilization can look permanent right up until the moment those connections begin to fail. That does not mean collapse is inevitable. And it does not mean we should live in fear of every storm, every strange light in the sky, every rumour of disaster. Fear is easy. Fear turns uncertainty into certainty. It makes people vulnerable to anyone claiming they alone know what is coming. Thoughtful vigilance is harder. It means recognizing real risks without inventing imaginary ones. It means paying attention to evidence. It means preparing for ordinary disasters instead of obsessing over spectacular ones. It means asking whether our communities could handle a prolonged power outage, a flood, a fire, a heat wave, a supply disruption, or a public health emergency. And it means understanding that the greatest danger is often not the event itself. It is what people do to one another when they believe the rules no longer apply. This is where the Kolbrin's warning becomes less cosmic and more human. A natural disaster can destroy buildings. Internal division can destroy the ability to recover. When trust collapses, rumours spread faster than facts. When people cannot tell reliable information from manipulation, every crisis becomes worse. When leaders lie, hide information, or treat suffering as somebody else's problem, cooperation breaks down. When communities divide into camps that see each other as enemies, even basic preparation becomes difficult. You can have warehouses full of supplies and still fail if nobody trusts the people distributing them. You can have scientific knowledge and still fail if people have been taught to reject every source of expertise. You can have roads, hospitals, tools and communication systems, but if the social bonds holding people together are gone, those systems become much harder to use. That is why the survivors in catastrophe stories are never just the strongest individuals. Survival is collective. The people who endure are the ones who share information. The ones who know where water can be found, the ones who can repair tools, grow food, treat injuries, organize labour, care for children, and settle disputes before they become violence. The ones who understand that protecting knowledge is not a luxury for peaceful times. It is part of survival itself. Imagine two communities facing the same disaster. One has spent years distrusting every institution, mocking expertise, hoarding resources, and treating every stranger as a threat. The other has emergency plans, local networks, trained volunteers, reliable communication, and people who know their neighbours well enough to check on them when things go wrong. Neither community is invincible, but one begins the crisis already broken. The other begins with the ability to respond. That is not prophecy. That is resilience. And resilience does not require a bunker, a private stockpile, or a belief that the world is ending. It can be surprisingly ordinary. Learning basic first aid, keeping emergency supplies, supporting trustworthy local institutions, knowing who might need help during a heat wave or storm, preserving important records, teaching practical skills, protecting libraries, archives, schools, and the accumulated knowledge that lets each generation avoid starting from zero. It also means protecting something less visible, but just as important. The habit of telling the truth. Every civilization depends on accurate information flowing through it. Farmers need to know when weather patterns change. Doctors need reliable reports about disease. Engineers need honest inspections. Families need warnings they can trust. Governments need criticism when policies fail. People need to be able to say, "We do not know," without turning uncertainty into panic. A society that cannot distinguish evidence from rumour is already vulnerable, even on a clear and peaceful day. So perhaps the lasting question of the Kolbrin is not, when will the destroyer return? Perhaps that question is too easy. The harder question is this: what kind of people are we becoming before anything happens? Are we building systems that can absorb shocks, or systems that fail when one link breaks? Are we preserving knowledge, or drowning it in noise? Are we strengthening trust, or training ourselves to suspect everyone? Are we preparing our children to cooperate, adapt, and think clearly, or merely teaching them to fear? Because every story of collapse contains two stories at once. There is the story of what was lost, and there is the story of what survivors chose to carry forward. The Kolbrin, whatever its origins, keeps returning to that second story. After the darkness, people remain. After order breaks, somebody has to rebuild it. After knowledge is scattered, somebody has to remember. And after suffering, somebody has to decide whether the new world will repeat the failures of the old one. That is the difference between fear-driven prophecy and thoughtful vigilance. Fear says disaster is coming, so nothing matters. Vigilance says disaster is possible, so what we do now matters more than ever. And that leaves us with one final question. Not about a hidden planet, an ancient manuscript, or the exact shape of the next catastrophe. A question about us. When civilization falls, what will be left worth saving? Maybe that is the real reason the Kolbrin Bible continues to fascinate people. Not because it gives us a reliable timetable for the end of the world. It does not because it proves that an ancient civilization knew the exact mechanics of a future cosmic disaster. It does not do that either, and not because every dramatic image in its pages should be treated as literal history, literal astronomy, or a coded warning meant specifically for our time. The evidence simply does not support that level of certainty. The Kolbrin remains a disputed text. Its claimed history is difficult to verify. Its manuscripts, origins, translations and publication history raise serious questions. Some of its material may draw on older religious, mythological and apocalyptic traditions. Some may reflect more recent writing shaped to sound ancient. And many of the boldest claims surrounding it, especially online, go far beyond what the text itself can reasonably establish. That matters, because uncertainty is not an invitation to invent certainty. When we do not know where a text came from, we should say so. When a claim cannot be verified, we should not present it as fact. When people turn ancient catastrophe language into a prediction machine, attaching dates, planets, secret cycles, and supposedly hidden knowledge to every line, they are often doing the opposite of what serious historical thinking requires. They are replacing questions with answers that feel exciting. But there is a difference between dismissing a text as proven history and dismissing it as meaningless. A story does not have to be a literal record to reveal something real about the people who preserve it. Flood stories can reveal fear of water, loss, and displacement. Fire from the sky stories can reveal how vulnerable people felt beneath an unpredictable universe. Tales of ruined cities can reveal a terrifying realization that wealth, walls, rulers, temples, and traditions are not permanent. They can all vanish faster than anyone expects, and maybe that is why catastrophe stories appear again and again across human history. Not because every culture witnessed the same event. Not because every myth is a scientific report, but because people everywhere have understood at some level that order is fragile. A harvest can fail, a river can flood, a disease can spread. A war can turn neighbours into enemies. A system that seemed stable for generations can begin breaking down in a matter of months. And once it does, survival becomes more than a question of who has food, water, shelter, or strength. Those things matter. Of course they matter. But the stories that endure after collapse are rarely only about stockpiles and escape. They are about memory. They are about who remembers where the seeds were stored. Who knows how to find clean water, who can make a fire, repair a tool, deliver a child, treat a wound, navigate by the landscape, preserve food, build shelter, settle an argument before it becomes a blood feud. They are about who carries the old knowledge into the new world. And just as important, they are about what kind of knowledge deserves to be carried. Because not everything from the old civilization should survive unchanged. Every fallen society leaves behind more than its achievements. It leaves behind its mistakes, its inequalities, its lies. its habits of exploitation, its hunger for power, its willingness to sacrifice the future for the comfort of the present. The survivors face a choice. Do they rebuild the same world that failed them? Or do they build something wiser from its ruins? That is the question beneath the Kolbrin's darkness, beneath the destroyer, beneath the flood, the trembling earth, and the collapsing kingdoms. Not can human beings survive? We know they can. Our entire species is evidence of that. Human beings have survived ice ages, droughts, migrations, epidemics, wars, eruptions, famines, and disasters. So ancient we no longer know the names of the people who endured them. Again and again, communities have been broken apart, and again, somebody has gathered what remained and begun the difficult work of starting over. The deeper question is whether survival alone is enough. Imagine the familiar systems of your life disappearing. The lights go out, not for an evening, but for weeks. Stores empty, phones stop working, reliable transportation becomes uncertain. The institutions you assumed would respond are overwhelmed, far away, or gone. Suddenly the things that seemed ordinary become priceless. A person who knows first aid, a neighbour who shares information instead of spreading rumours, a teacher with books, a mechanic with tools, a farmer with seeds, a family that knows how to cooperate under pressure, a community that can still recognise truth, still care for the vulnerable, still organise without turning cruel. In that moment, what would you protect first? Not just what object, what idea, what skill, what memory? What would you teach the children who came after? Would you teach them only to fear the world, or would you teach them how to understand it? Would you teach them that strangers are always enemies? Or that survival becomes possible when people learn to trust carefully, share wisely, and work together? Would you preserve the knowledge that gives people power over one another, or the knowledge that helps people feed, heal, build, and endure? Because civilization is not only buildings, machines, laws, markets, and networks. Civilization is also a promise. The promise that knowledge will not die with one generation. The promise that the strong have responsibilities to the weak. The promise that truth matters even when lies are easier. The promise that after disaster, grief, and loss, people can choose not to become the disaster themselves. Maybe that is the final warning in the Kolbrin Bible. Not that the sky will someday fall, but that a civilization can begin falling long before the ground shakes. It falls when people stop caring what is true. It falls when memory is neglected. It falls when knowledge is treated as disposable. It falls when cooperation is replaced by contempt. And it falls when a society becomes so focused on protecting itself that it forgets what it was supposed to protect. So, whatever the Kolbrin really is, whatever ancient fragments, later inventions, religious ideas, and modern interpretations may have shaped it, its most valuable question remains open. If the world you know disappeared tomorrow, what would you carry forward? What would you save? What would you teach? And what would you rebuild differently? If this story gave you something to think about, please like the video, comment and subscribe for more deep dives into history, myths, mysteries, and the stories humans tell when they are trying to make sense of catastrophe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.